Thank you for listening to our audiobooks. We do our best to regularly upload quality books with clear narrations. Please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell icon so we can bring you more great books. Thank you very much and enjoy your audiobook.
Lyonesse, Book 1. Suldrun's Garden. Preliminary. The Elder Isles and its peoples, a brief survey, which, while not altogether tedious, may be neglected by the reader impatient with facts. The Elder Isles, now sunk beneath the Atlantic, in olden times were located across the Cantabrian Gulf, now the Bay of Biscay, from Old Gaul. Christian chroniclers have little to say regarding the Elder Isles. Gildas and Nennius both make references to Hybris, though Bede is silent. Geoffrey of Monmouth alludes both to Lyonesse and Avalon, and perhaps other places and events which can less certainly be identified. Chrétien of Troyes rhapsodizes upon Is and its pleasures, and Is is also the frequent locale of early Armorican folk tales. Irish references are numerous but confusing and contradictory. St. Brisabrius of Cardiff propounds a rather fanciful list of the kings of Lyonesse. St. Columba inveighs against the heretics, witches, idolaters, and druids of the island he calls High Brazil, the medieval term for Hybris. Otherwise, the record is quiet. Greeks and Phoenicians traded with the Elder Isles. Romans visited Hybris, and many settled there, leaving behind aqueducts, roads, villas, and temples. In the waning days of the empire, Christian dignitaries landed at Avalon amid vast pomp and panoply. They established bishoprics, appointed appropriate officials, and spent good Roman gold to build their basilicas, none of which prospered. The bishops strove mightily against the olden gods, halflings and magicians alike, but few dared enter the forest of Tantreval. Aspergillums, thuribles, and curses proved futile against such as Dankvin the Giant, Tawdry the Weasening, the fairies of Pithpenny-Shee. Dozens of missionaries, exalted through faith, paid terrible prices for their zeal. St. Elric marched barefoot to Smoorish Rock, where he intended to subdue the ogre Mager and bring him to the faith. According to subsequent tale-tellers, St. Elric arrived at noon, and Mager politely agreed to hear his declaration. Elric spoke a mighty sermon, while Mager started the fire in his pit. Elric expounded, recited scripture, and sang the glories of the faith. When he came to an end and declared his final Hallelujah, Mager gave him a stoup of ale to ease his throat. Sharpening a knife, he complimented Elric upon the fervor of his rhetoric. Then he smote off Elric's head, cut, drew, spitted, cooked, and devoured the sanctified morsel with a garnish of leeks and cabbages. St. Uldine attempted the baptism of a troll in the waters of Black Mira Tarn. She was indefatigable. He raped her 4 times during her efforts, until at last she despaired. In due course she gave birth to 4 imps. The first of these, Ignaldus, became father to the eerie knight Sir Sacrantine, who could not sleep of nights until he had killed a Christian. St. Uldine's other children were Draith, Alia, and Basile. The deeds of the 4 have been chronicled in a rare volume, St. Uldine's Children. In Godelia, druids never paused in the worship of Lug the sun, Matrona the moon, Adonis the beautiful, Cernunn the stag, Mocus the boar, Kai the dark, Shea the graceful, and innumerable local half-gods. During this period, Olam Magnus of Lyonesse, aided by Persilion, his so-called magic mirror, brought all the Elder Isles, excepting Skagane and Godelia, under his rule. Styling himself Olam I, he enjoyed a long and prosperous reign, and was succeeded by Rordek I, Olam II, then briefly by the Galician Cuckoos, Quarnitz I, and Nifith I. Then Phafion Longnose reasserted the old bloodline. He sired Olam III, who moved his throne Evandig and that great table known as Kerbra on Maiden, the board of notables, from Lyonesse town to Avalon in the Duchy of Dehout. The Round Table of King Arthur was later inspired by the Cair-Braun maiden. When Olam III's grandson Uther II fled to Britain, there to sire Uther Pendragon, father of Arthur, king of Cornwall, the land fragmented to become 10 kingdoms: Dehout, Lyonesse, North Ulfland, South Ulfland, Godelia, Blaylock, Cades, Pomperol, Dacinet, and Trosinet. The new kings found many pretexts for contention, and the Elder Isles entered a time of trouble. North and South Ulfland, exposed to the Ska, became lawless wastes, occupied by robber knights and dire beasts. Only the Vale Evander, guarded to the east by the castle Tinsin-Firel and to the west by the city Is, remained a realm of tranquility. King Audrey I of Dehout at last took a fateful step. He declared that since he sat on the throne Evandig, he must be acknowledged king of the Elder Isles. King Friston of Lyonesse at once challenged him. Audrey assembled a great army and marched down Icknield Way through Pomperol and into Lyonesse. King Friston led his army north. At the Battle of Orm Hill, the armies fought for 2 days and finally separated in mutual exhaustion. Both Friston and Audrey died in combat and both armies retired. Audrey II failed to press his father's claim. Effectively, Friston had won the battle. 20 years pass. The Ska have made serious inroads into North Ulfland and have taken to themselves a section known as the North Foreshore. King Gax, old, half-blind, and helpless, has gone into hiding. The Ska do not even trouble to search for him. The king of South Ulfland is Orianti, who resides at Castle Svan Sveg near the town Awaldis. His single son, Prince Quilci, is feeble-minded and spends his days playing with fanciful dolls and dollhouses. Audrey II is king of Dehout and Casimir is king of Lyonesse, and both intend to become king of the Elder Isles and sit rightfully on the throne Evandig. Chapter 1. On a dreary winter's day, with rain sweeping across Lyonesse town, Queen Solace went into labor. She was taken to the lying-in room and attended by 2 midwives, 4 maids, Balhamel the physician, and the crone named Dildra, who was profound in the lore of herbs and by some considered a witch. Dildra was present by the wish of Queen Solace, who found more comfort in faith than logic. King Casimir made an appearance. Solace's whimpers became moans, and she clawed at her thick blonde hair with clenched fingers. Casimir watched from across the room. He wore a simple scarlet robe with a purple sash. A gold coronet confined his ruddy blonde hair. He spoke to Balhamel. "What are the signs?" "Sire, there are none as yet." "There is no way to divine the sex?" "To my knowledge, none." Standing in the doorway, legs somewhat apart, hands behind his back, Casimir seemed the very embodiment of stern and kingly majesty, and indeed this was an attitude which accompanied him everywhere, so that kitchen maids, tittering and giggling, often wondered if Casimir wore his crown to the nuptial bed. He inspected Solace from under frowning eyebrows. "It would seem that she feels pain." "Her pain is not so much, sire, as might be, not yet at any rate. Remember, fear magnifies that pain which actually exists." To this observation, Casimir made no response. He noticed in the shadows to the side of the room Dildra the crone, where she crouched over a brazier. He pointed with his finger. "Why is the witch here?" "Sire," whispered the chief midwife, "she came at the behest of Queen Solace." Casimir grunted. "She'll bring a rack to the child." Dildra only crouched the lower over the brazier. She threw a handful of herbs on the coals. A waft of acrid smoke drifted across the room and touched Casimir's face. He coughed, backed away, and departed the room. The maid drew hangings across the wet landscape and set the bronze lanterns alight. On the couch, Solace lay taut, Legs outthrust, head thrown back, her regal bulk fascinating the attention of those who stood tending her. The pangs became sharp. Solace cried out, first for pain, then for rage that she should suffer like a common woman. 2 hours later, the child was born. A girl, of no great size. Solace closed her eyes and lay back. When the child was brought to her, she waved it away and presently relaxed into a stupor. The celebration attendant upon the birth of Princess Suldrun was muted. King Casimir issued no jubilant proclamation, and Queen Solace refused audience to all save a certain Ewaldo Idra, adept of the Caucasian mysteries. Finally, and only so it seemed that he might not contravene custom, King Casimir ordained a gala procession. On a day of brittle white sunlight, cold wind, and high hurrying clouds, the gates before Castle Hadion opened. 4 heralds in white satin marched forth at a stately step-halt step. From their clarions depended gonfalons of white silk, embroidered with the emblem of Lyonesse, a black tree of life on which grew 12 scarlet pomegranates. They marched 40 yards, halted, raised clarions, and blew the gladsome tidings fanfare. From the palace yard, on snorting white horses, rode 4 noblemen, Cyprus, Duke of Scroy, Bannoy, Duke of Tremblance, Odo, Duke of Folies, and Sir Garnel, Knight Banneret of Castle Swange, nephew to the king. Next came the royal carriage, drawn by 4 white unicorns. Queen Solace sat swathed in green robes, holding Suldrun on a crimson pillow. King Casimir rode his great black horse, Sheovan, beside the carriage. Behind marched the elite guard, each of noble blood, carrying ceremonial silver halberts. At the rear rolled a wagon from which a pair of maidens tossed handfuls of pennies into the throng. The procession descended the spur arced, the central avenue of Lyonesse town, to the Chail, the road which followed the semicircle of the harbor. At the Chail, the procession circled the fish market and returned up the spur arced to Hadion. Outside the gate, booths offered the king's pickled fish and biscuits to all who hungered, and ale to those who might wish to drink health to the new princess. During the months of winter and spring, King Casimir looked only twice at the infant princess, in each case standing back in cool disinterest. She had thwarted his royal will by coming female into the world. He could not immediately punish her for the act, no more could he extend the full beneficence of his favor. Solace grew sulky because Casimir was displeased, and with a set of petulant flourishes banished the child from her sight. Aherm, a raw-boned peasant girl and niece to an under-gardener, had lost her own infant son to the yellow bloat. With an amplitude of both milk and solicitude, she became Suldrun's wet nurse. Centuries in the past, at the middle-distant time when legend and history start to blur, Blouse-Redden the pirate built a fortress at the back of a stony semicircular harbor. His concern was not so much assault from the sea, but surprise attacks down from the pinnacles and gorges of the mountains to the north of the harbor. A century later, the Danan king, Tabro, enclosed the harbor behind a remarkable breakwater and added the old hall, new kitchens, and a set of sleeping chambers to the fortress. His son, Zoltra Brightstar, constructed a massive stone pier and dredged the harbor so that any ship in the world might moor at the pier. Zoltra further augmented the old fortress, adding the Great Hall and the West Tower, though he died before completion of the work, which continued through the reigns of Palamon I, Advarius I, and Palamon II. The Hadion of King Casimir held aloft 5 major towers: the East Tower, the King's Tower, the Tall Tower, also known as the Eyrie, the Tower of Palamon, and the West Tower. There were 5 major halls: the Great Hall, the Hall of Honors, the Old Hall, the Clod-on-Dock Nair, or the Banquet Hall, and the small refectory. Of these, the great hall was remarkable for its ponderous majesty, which seemed to transcend the scope of human effort. The proportions, the spaces and masses, the contrasts of shadow and light, which changed from morning to evening, and again to the moving illumination of flamboys, all acted together to awe the senses. The entrances were almost afterthoughts. In any case, no one could achieve a dramatic entrance into the great hall. At one end, a portal entered upon a narrow stage, from which 6 wide steps descended into the hall, beside columns so massive that a pair of men, arms outstretched, could not enclasp them. To one side, a row of high windows, glazed with thick glass, now lavender with age, admitted a watery half-light. At night, flamboys in iron brackets seemed to cast as much black shadow as light. 12 Mauritanian rugs eased the harshness of the stone floor. A pair of iron doors opened into the Hall of Honors, which in scope and proportion resembled the nave of a cathedral. A heavy dark red carpet ran down the center from entrance to royal throne. Around the walls ranged 54 massive chairs, each signified by an emblem of nobility hanging on the wall above. On these chairs, for ceremonial occasions, sat the grandees of Lyonesse, each under the emblem of his ancestors. The royal throne, until Olam III moved it to Avalon, had been Evandic, and the round table, Kerbra on Maiden, occupied the center of the hall where the noblest of the noble might discover their named places. The Hall of Honors had been added by King Carls, last of the Methuen dynasty. Clod the Red, first of the Tyrrhenians, extended Hadion's precincts to the east of Zoltra's wall. He paved the Urquell, Zoltra's old parade ground, and to the back built the massive Painhodder, in which housed infirmary, barracks, and penitentiary. The dungeons under the old armory fell into disuse, with the ancient cages, racks, griddles, wheels, strappado lofts, presses, punches, and twisting machines left to molder in the damp. The kings proceeded to rule one by one, and each augmented Hadion's halls, passages, prospects, galleries, towers, and turrets, as if each, brooding on mortality, sought to make himself part of ageless Hadion. For those who lived there, Hadion was a small universe indifferent to the events of elsewhere, though the membrane of separation was not impermeable. There were rumors from abroad, notices of the changing seasons, arrivals and excursions, an occasional novelty or alarm, but these were muffled murmurs, dim images, which barely stirred the organs of the palace. A comet flaring across the sky, marvelous, but forgotten when Shilk the potboy kicks the undercook's cat. The Ska have ravaged North Ulfland. The Ska are like wild animals, but this morning, after eating cream on her porridge, the Duchess of Scroy found a dead mouse in the cream jug, and here was emotion raw and stark, what with her outcries and shoes thrown at the maids. The laws which ruled the small universe were exact. Status was graduated with the finest of discrimination, from high degree to lowest of the low. Each knew his quality and understood the delicate distinction between next highest, to be minimized, and next lowest, to be enforced and emphasized. Some encroached beyond their station, generating tension. The sharp stench of rancor hung in the air. Each scrutinized the conduct of those above, while concealing his own affairs from those below. The royal personages were watched with care, their habits were discussed and analyzed a dozen times a day. Queen Solace showed great cordiality to religious zealots and priests, and found much of interest in their creeds. She was thought to be sexually cold and never took lovers. King Casimir made connubial visits to her bed regularly, once each month, and they coupled with stately ponderosity, like the mating of elephants. Princess Suldrun occupied a peculiar place in the social structure of the palace. The indifference of King Casimir and Queen Solace was duly noted. Petty discourtesies therefore might be visited upon Suldrun with impunity. The years passed, and without any notice being taken, Suldrun became a quiet child with long, soft blonde hair. Because no one saw fit to arrange otherwise, a herm made the leap in status from wet nurse to the private maid of the princess. Eherm, untrained in etiquette and not greatly gifted in other ways, had assimilated lore from her Celtic grandfather, which across the seasons and over the years she communicated to Suldrun, tales and fables, the perils of far places, dints against the mischief of fairies, the language of flowers, precautions while walking out at midnight and the avoidance of ghosts, the knowledge of good trees and bad trees. Suldrun learned of lands which lay beyond the castle. 2 roads lead from Lyonesse town, said Eherm. You may go north through the mountains along the Spur Arct, or you go east through Zoltra's Gate and across the Urquell. Presently you come to my little cottage and our 3 fields where we grow cabbages, turnips, and hay for the beasts. Then the road forks. To the right you follow the shore of the Lear, all the way to Sloot Scheme. To the left you fare north and join the Old Street, which runs beside the forest of Tantreval, where the fairies live. 2 roads pass through the forest, north to south and east to west. Tell what happens where they meet. Suldrun already knew, but she enjoyed the zest of Eherm's descriptions. Eherm warned her. I've never fared so far, you understand, but what grandfather says is this. In the old times, the crossroads would move about, because the place was enchanted and never knew peace. This might be well enough for the traveller, because, after all, he would put 1 foot ahead of him, and then the other, and the road would at last be won, and the traveller none the wiser that he had seen twice as much forest as he had bargained for. The most troubled were the folk who sold their goods each year at the Goblin Fair. And where was that but at the crossroads? The folk for the fair were most put out, because the fair should be at the crossroads on midsummer night, but when they arrived at the crossroads it had shifted 2 miles and a half, and nowhere a fair to be seen. About this time the magicians vied in awful conflict. Mergen proved the strongest and defeated Twitten, whose father was a halfling, his mother a bald priestess at Kai Kang under the Atlas Mountains. What to do with the defeated magician, who seethed with evil and hate? Mergen rolled him up and forged him into a stout iron post, 10 foot long and thick as my leg. Then Mergen took this enchanted post to the crossroads and waited till it shifted to the proper place. Then he drove the iron post down deep in the centre, fixing the crossroads so it no longer could move, and all the folk at the Goblin Fair were glad and spoke well of Mergen. Tell about Goblin Fair. Well then, it's the place and time when the halflings and men can meet and none will harm the other, so long as he stays polite. The folk set up booths and sell all manner of fine things, cobweb cloth and wine of violets and silver bottles, books of fairy skein, written with words that you can't get out of your head once they're in. You'll see all kinds of halflings, fairies and goblins, trolls and merrihews, and even an odd falloy, though they show themselves seldom out of shyness, despite being the most beautiful of all. You'll hear songs and music and much chinking of fairy gold, which they squeeze from buttercups. Oh, they're a rare folk, the fairies. Tell how you saw them. Oh, indeed. It was 5 years ago, when I was with my sister, who married the cobbler in Frogmarsh village. One time, just at gloaming, I sat by the stile to rest my bones and watch while evening came over the meadow. I heard tink-a-tink tinkle, and I looked and listened. Again, tink-a-tink tinkle, and there, not 20 paces distant, came a little fellow with a lantern that gave green light. From the beak of his cap hung a silver bell that went tink-a-tink-tinkle as he jumped along. I sat quiet as a post till he was gone with his bell and green lantern, and that's all there is to it. Tell about the ogre. No, that's quite enough for today. Do tell, please. Well, in truth, I know not all that much. There are different sorts among the halflings, different as fox from bear, so that fairy and ogre and goblin and skite are different. All are enemies, each to each, except at the goblin fair. The ogres live deep in the forest, and it's true, they'll take children and roast them on spits. So never you run too far into the forest for berries, lest you be lost. I'll be careful. Now tell me. It's time for your porridge, and today, who knows, there might be a nice rosy apple in my bag yonder. Suldrun took lunch in her small sitting room, or, if the weather were fine, in the orangery, delicately nibbling and sipping while Eherm held the spoon to her mouth. In due course, she fed herself with careful movements and sober concentration, as if the most important thing in the world were eating daintily without mess. Eherm found the habit both absurd and endearing, and sometimes she would come up behind Suldrun and say, "Boo!" in her ear, just as Suldrun opened her mouth for a spoonful of soup. Suldrun pretended to be outraged and reproached Eherm. "That is a naughty trick." Then she once more commenced to eat, watching Eherm carefully from the corner of her eye. Away from Suldrun's chambers, Eherm moved as unobtrusively as possible, but gradually the fact emerged that Eherm, the peasant girl, had stolen a march on her betters. The matter was referred to Dame Budetta, mistress of the household, a severe and uncompromising lady born into the petty gentility. Her duties were manifold. She supervised the female servants, monitored their virtue, arbitrated questions of propriety. She knew the special conventions of the palace. She was a compendium of genealogical information and even greater masses of scandal. Bianca, an upper chambermaid, first brought complaint of Eherm. "She's an outsider and doesn't even live at the palace. She comes in smelling of pigs, and now she's taken to all manner of airs just because she sweeps out little Suldrun's bedchamber." "Yes, yes," said Dame Budetta, speaking through her long, high-bridged nose. "I know all about it." "Another thing," Bianca now spoke with sly emphasis. "Princess Suldrun, as we all know, has little to say, and may be just a trifle backward." "Bianca, that is quite enough." "But when she does speak, her accent is atrocious. What when King Casimir decides to converse with the princess and hears the voice of a stable boy?" "Your point is well taken," said Dame Budetta loftily. "Still, I have already given the matter thought. Remember, I am well suited to the office of personal maid, and my accent is excellent, and I am thoroughly conversant with details of deportment and dress. I will keep this in mind." In the end, Dame Budetta appointed a gentlewoman of middle quality to the post, in fact, her cousin Dame Maugelin, to whom she owed a favor. Eherm was forthwith discharged and sent trudging home with hanging head. Suldrun, at this time, was 4 years old, and ordinarily docile, gentle and easy of disposition, if somewhat remote and pensive. Upon learning of the change, she stood transfixed in shock. Eherm was the single living object in the world whom she loved. Suldrun made no outcry. She climbed to her chamber, and for 10 minutes stood looking down over the town. Then she wrapped her doll into a kerchief, pulled on her hooded cloak of soft gray lamb's wool, and quietly departed the palace. She ran up the arcade which flanked the east wing of Hadeon, and slipped under Zoltra's wall by a dank passage 20 feet long. She ran across the Urquell, ignoring the grim pain-hodder and the gallows on the roof from which dangled a pair of corpses. With the Urquhart behind, Suldrun trotted along the road until she was tired, then walked. Suldrun knew the way well enough, along the road to the first lane, left along the lane to the first cottage. She shyly pushed open the door to find Eherm sitting glumly at a table, paring turnips for the supper soup. Eherm stared in astonishment. "And what are you doing here?" "I don't like Dame Maugolan. I've come to live with you." "Ah, little princess, but that won't do. Come, we must get you back before there's an outcry. Who saw you leave?" "No one." "Come then, quickly now. If any should ask, we're just out for the air." "I don't want to stay there alone." "Suldrun, my dearest, you must. You're a royal princess, and you may never forget it. That means you do as you're told. Come along now." "But I won't do as I'm told, if it means that you'll be gone." "Well, we'll see. Let's hurry. Maybe we can slip in with none the wiser." But Suldrun already had been missed. While her presence at Hadeon meant nothing particular to anyone, her absence was a matter of great import. Dame Maugolan had searched the entire East Tower from the garret under the roof slates, which Suldrun was known to visit. Skulking and hiding, the secret little imp, thought Dame Maugolan, down through the observatory, where King Casimir came to assess the harbor, beyond, down through the chambers on the next floor, which included Suldrun's rooms. Finally, hot, tired, and apprehensive, she descended to the main floor to halt in mingled relief and fury to see Suldrun and Eherm push open the heavy door and come quietly into the foyer at the end of the main gallery. In an angry swirl of robes, Dame Maugolan descended the last 3 stairs and advanced upon the two. "Where have you been? We are all in a state of supreme anxiety. Come, we must find Dame Budetta. The matter is in her hands." Dame Maugolan marched off down the gallery and along a side corridor to Dame Budetta's office, with Suldrun and Eherm following apprehensively behind. Dame Budetta heard Dame Maugolan's excited report and looked back and forth between Suldrun and Eherm. The matter seemed of no great moment, in fact trivial and tiresome. Still, it represented a certain amount of insubordination, and so must be dealt with, briskly and decisively. The question of fault was irrelevant. Dame Budetta ranked Suldrun's intelligence, sluggish though it might be, about on a par with the moony peasant stupidity of Eherm. Suldrun, of course, could not be punished. Even Solace would rise in wrath to learn that royal flesh had been scourged. Dame Budetta dealt practically with the affair. She turned a cold gaze upon Eherm. "Now then, woman, what have you done?" Eherm, whose mind indeed was not agile, looked blankly at Dame Budetta. "I have done nothing, my lady." Then, hoping to ease matters for Suldrun, she blundered on. "It was just one of our little walks we were having, wasn't it, princess dear?" Suldrun, looking from hawk-like Dame Budetta to portly Dame Maugolan, discovered only expressions of cold dislike. She said, "I went for a walk, that is true." Dame Budetta turned upon Eherm. "How dare you take such liberties upon yourself? Were you not dismissed from your post?" "Yes, my lady, but it wasn't like that at all." "Tush! No more. I will hear no excuses." Budetta signaled to a footman. "Take this woman to the yard and assemble the staff." Sobbing in bewilderment, Eherm was led to the service yard beside the kitchen, and a jailer was summoned down from the pain-hodder. The palace staff was marshaled to watch, while Eherm was bent over a trestle by a pair of footmen in Hadeon livery. The jailer came forward, a burly, black-bearded man with a pallid, almost lavender skin. He stood idly by, staring at the maids, and twitching his scourge of willow withes. Dame Boudetta stood on a balcony with Dame Maugolan and Suldrun. In a clear nasal voice she cried out, "Attention, staff! I cite this woman, Eherm, for malfeasance. Through folly and carelessness, she sequestered the person of beloved Princess Suldrun to cause us grief and consternation. Woman, can you now claim contrition?" Suldrun cried out, "She didn't do anything. She brought me home." Beset by that peculiar passion which attends those at an execution, Dame Maugolan dared so far as to pinch Suldrun's arm and drew her roughly back. "Silence!" she hissed. Eherm bawled, "I'm shamed if I did wrong. I only walked the princess home in haste." Dame Boudetta suddenly, in all clarity, perceived the truth of the matter. Her mouth sagged. She stepped forward. Events had gone too far. Her dignity was at stake. No doubt Eherm had escaped punishment for other offenses. There was always her presumptuous behavior to be paid off. Dame Boudetta raised her hand. "For all a lesson to be learned. Work dutifully. Never presume. Respect your superiors. Watch and take heed. Warden, 8 strokes. Stringent, but just." The jailer stood back, pulled a black executioner's mask over his face, then advanced upon Eherm. He threw her brown fur skirt up over her shoulders, exposing a pair of ample white buttocks. He raised the switches high. Thwishwhack! A gasping cry from Eherm. From the onlookers a mingling of indrawn breaths and titters. Dame Boudetta looked on impassively. Dame Maugolan showed a pursing, mindless smile. Suldrun stood silently, biting her lower lip. With self-critical deliberation, the jailer wielded the scourge. While not a kindly man, he had no taste for pain, and today he was in good humor. He contrived a mighty effort, swinging his shoulders, lurching, grunting, but laid small actual weight into his strokes, and took away no skin. Eherm nevertheless bellowed with each stroke, and all were awed by the severity of her thrashing. 7, 8, enough, declared Dame Boudetta. Trinth, Molatta, attend the woman, dress her body with good oil, and send her home. The rest of you, return to your work. Dame Boudetta turned, marched from the balcony into a parlor for high-caste servants, such as herself, the seneschal, the bursar, the sergeant of the palace guards, and the master steward, where they could take refreshment and confer. Dame Maugolan and Suldrun followed. Dame Boudetta faced Suldrun to find her already halfway to the door. "Child, Princess Suldrun, where are you going?" Dame Maugolan ran heavy-legged to stand in Suldrun's way. Suldrun halted and looked from woman to woman, her eyes glinting with tears. "Please give me your attention, Princess," said Dame Boudetta. "We are starting something new, which perhaps has been delayed too long, your education. You must learn to be a lady of esteem and dignity. Dame Maugolan will instruct you." "I don't want her." "Nevertheless, you shall have her, by particular order of gracious Queen Solace." Suldrun looked up full into Dame Boudetta's face. "Some day I will be queen. Then you will be whipped." Dame Boudetta opened her mouth, then shut it again. She took a quick step toward Suldrun, who stood half passive, half defiant. Dame Boudetta halted. Dame Maugolan, grinning mirthlessly, watched from the side, eyes looking in several directions. Dame Boudetta spoke in a croaking voice, painfully gentle. "Now then, Princess Suldrun, I act only from devotion to yourself. It is not meet for either queen or princess to use peevish vindictiveness. From Dame Maugolan came an unctuous corroboration.
"So it is indeed. Remember the same for Dame Maugolan." "The punishment is now accomplished," declared Dame Budetta, still using a careful and strained voice. "Everyone will surely be the better for it. Now, we must put it from our minds. You are the precious Princess Suldrun, and honest Dame Maugolan will instruct you in the proprieties." "I don't want her. I want Ehem." "Tush now. Be complacent."
Suldrun was taken to her chamber. Dame Maugolan plumped herself in a chair and began to work embroidery. Suldrun went to the window and stared out across the harbor. Dame Maugolan trudged up the circular stone steps to Dame Budetta's apartments, hips rolling and thrusting under her dark brown gown. On the third floor she halted to pant, then went to an arched door of fitted timbers, bound with black iron straps. The door stood ajar. Dame Maugolan pushed it somewhat more open, with a creaking of iron hinges, so that she could pass her amplitude through the gap. She advanced to stand in the doorway, eyes darting to all corners of the room at once. Dame Budetta sat at a table, tendering rapeseed on the tip of a long, thin forefinger to a caged tomtit.
"Peck, Dicko, peck, like a gallant bird. Ah, that was a good one."
Dame Maugolan crept a pace or two forward, and at last Dame Budetta looked up.
"What is it now?"
Dame Maugolan shook her head, wrung her hands, and licked her pursing lips.
"The child is like a stone. I can do nothing with her."
Dame Budetta made a short, brittle sound.
"You must be brisk. Arrange a schedule. Insist on obedience."
Dame Maugolan held her arms wide and spoke a single poignant word.
"How?"
Dame Budetta gave an annoyed snap of tongue against teeth. She turned back to the birdcage.
"Dicko, twit, twit, Dicko. One more peck, and that is all, no more."
Dame Budetta rose to her feet, and with Dame Maugolan in her wake, went downstairs and up to Suldrun's chambers. She opened the door, looked into the sitting room.
"Princess?"
Suldrun made no response, and indeed was nowhere to be seen. The two advanced into the room.
"Princess," called Dame Budetta, "are you hiding from us? Come now, don't be naughty."
Dame Maugolan moaned in a sad contralto.
"Where is the perverse little thing? I gave stern instructions that she must sit in her chair."
Dame Budetta looked into the bedchamber.
"Princess Suldrun, where are you?"
She cocked her head sideways to listen, but heard nothing. The chambers were empty. Dame Maugolan muttered,
"She's gone off again to the Stour woman."
Dame Budetta went to the window, thinking to overlook a view to the east, but the way was concealed by the slanting tiled roof over the arcade and the mouldering bulk of Zoltra's wall. Below was the orangery. To the side, half hidden under dark green foliage, she noted the glimmer of Suldrun's white frock. Silent and grim, she stalked from the room, followed by Dame Maugolan, hissing and muttering furious phrases under her breath. They descended the stairs, went out and around to the orangery. Suldrun sat on a bench, playing with a wisp of grass. She noted the approach of the two women without emotion, and returned her attention to the grass. Dame Budetta halted and stood looking down at the small blonde head. Anger surged up within her, but she was too clever and too wary to allow it tangible scope. Behind stood Dame Maugolan, mouth puckered in excitement, hoping that Dame Budetta would deal roughly with the princess. A shake, a pinch, a slap on the firm little buttocks. Princess Suldrun raised her eyes and for a moment stared up at Dame Budetta. Then, as if in boredom or apathy, she looked away, and Dame Budetta was left with a strange sensation that she was seeing ahead, down long years of the future. Dame Budetta spoke in a voice grating with effort.
Princess Suldrun, you are not happy with Dame Maugelin's instruction? I don't like her, but you like Ehem.
Suldrun merely twitched the grass stalk.
Very well, said Dame Budetta grandly. So it will be. We cannot have our precious princess unhappy.
A quick glance upward, which seemed to read Dame Budetta through and through. Dame Budetta thought with bitter amusement, if that's the way it is, let it be. At least we understand each other. To Salvage Face, she said sternly,
Ehem shall return, but you must heed Dame Maugelin, who will instruct your deportment.
Chapter 2. Ehem returned, and Dame Maugelin continued her attempts to instruct Suldrun, with success no greater than before. Suldrun was not so much insubordinate as remote. Rather than spend effort in defying Dame Maugelin, she simply ignored her. Dame Maugelin was placed in an irksome predicament. If she admitted her incapacity, Dame Budetta might put her to even less pleasant employment. So daily Dame Maugelin presented herself to Suldrun's chambers, where Ehem was already on hand. The two might or might not acknowledge her presence. Dame Maugelin, then wearing a moony grin and looking in all directions at once, would wander about the room, pretending to put things to rights. At last she would advance upon Suldrun, in breezy and lightsome confidence.
Now, Princess, today we must think about making a fine court lady out of you. To start, show me your best curtsy.
Suldrun had been tentatively instructed in 6 curtsies of varying formality, mainly by Dame Maugelin's ponderous demonstrations, over and over again, joints creaking audibly, until Suldrun, taking pity, might make an attempt at the exercise. After the noon meal, which would be served either in Suldrun's chambers or in the orangery if the weather were fine, Ehem returned home to manage her own household, while Dame Maugelin laid herself down for an afternoon nap. Suldrun also was expected to sleep, but as soon as Dame Maugelin's throat began to rattle, Suldrun was out of her bed, into her shoes, and away along the hall and down the stairs, to wander the fastnesses of the ancient palace. During the slow hours of the afternoon, the palace itself seemed to drowse, and the small, frail shape moved along the galleries and through the tall chambers like a dream wisp. In sunny weather she might visit the orangery, to play pensive games in the shade of 16 old orange trees. More often she went by unobtrusive ways to the great hall, and thence to the hall of honors beyond, where 54 great chairs, ranking the walls to right and left, represented the 54 most noble houses of Lyonesse. The emblem above each chair, for Suldrun, told the innate nature of the chair, qualities distinctive, vivid, and complex. One chair was characterized by a shifting sidelong deceit, but pretended graceful charm. Another exhibited a doomed and reckless bravery. Suldrun recognized a dozen varieties of menace and cruelty, and as many nameless affections which could not be described or worded, which caused her a churning of the bowels, or thrills along her skin, or erotic sensations, transient, pleasant, but very strange. Certain chairs loved Suldrun and gave her protection, others were heavy with danger. Moving among these massive entities, Suldrun felt subdued and tentative. She walked with slow steps, listening for inaudible sounds and watching for movement or shifting of the muted colors. Sitting, half drowsing, half alert, in the arms of a chair who loved her, Suldrun became receptive. The murmuring, unheard voices approached the audible, as tragedies and triumphs were told and retold, the colloquy of the chairs. At the end of the room, a dark red gonfalon, embroidered with a tree of life, hung from the beams to the floor. A split in the fabric allowed access to a retiring chamber, a room dark and dingy, smelling of ancient dust. In this room were stored ceremonial oddments, a bowl carved from alabaster, chalices, bundles of cloth. Suldrun disliked the room. It seemed a cruel little place where cruel deeds had been planned and perhaps accomplished, leaving a subliminal quiver in the air. Occasionally the halls lacked zest. Then Suldrun might go out along the parapets of the old keep, where always there were interesting sights to be seen along the spur arched, travelers coming and going, wagons loaded high with barrels, bales, and baskets, vagabond knights in dented armor, grandees with their retinues, mendicants, wandering scholars, priests, and pilgrims of a dozen sects, country gentry come to buy good cloth, spices, trifles of this and that. To the north, the spher-arched passed between the crags Mager and Yax, petrified giants who had helped King Zoltra Brightstar dredge Lyonesse harbor. Becoming obstreperous, they had been transformed into stone by Amber the sorcerer. So the story went. From the parapets, Suldrun could see the harbor and wonderful ships from far lands creaking at their moorings. They were unattainable. To venture so far would arouse storms of reproach from Dame Maugelin. She might be taken in disgrace before Queen Solace, or even into the awesome presence of King Casimir. She had no wish to see either. Queen Solace was little more than an imperious voice from a billow of splendid robes. King Casimir, to Suldrun, meant a stern face with prominent blue eyes, golden curls and a golden crown on top, and a fringe of golden beard below. To risk confrontation with either Queen Solace or King Casimir was not to be considered. Suldrun confined her adventures to the precincts of Haedion. When Suldrun was 7, Queen Solace once more grew big, and on this occasion gave birth to a boy. Solace had lost some of her fear, and as a consequence suffered far less than she had with Suldrun. The baby was named Cassander. In due course, he would become Cassander V. He was born during the fine weather of summer, and the festivals attending his birth continued a week. Haedion hosted notable guests from across the Elder Isles. From Dacinet came Prince Othmar and his Aquitanian spouse, Princess Lyonesse, the Dukes Athabanus, Helingus, and Otramatyx, with their retinues. From Trosinet, King Granus sent his princely brothers Arbamet and Ospero, Arbamet's son Truin, and Ospero's son Ilus. From South Ulfland came Grand Duke Erwig, with a birth gift, a magnificent mahogany chest inlaid with red chert and blue turquoise. King Gax of North Ulfland, beleaguered by the Ska, made no representation. King Audrey of Dehout sent a delegation of nobles and a dozen elephants carved from ivory, and so it went. At the name-giving ceremony in the great hall, Princess Suldrun sat demurely with 6 daughters of the upper nobility. Opposite sat the princelings Truin and Ilus of Trosinet, Beleth of Cadiz, and the 3 young dukes of Dacinet. For the occasion, Suldrun wore a gown of pale blue velvet, and a fillet studded with moonstones confined her soft pale hair. She was clearly well-favored, and attracted the thoughtful attention of many persons who previously had paid her little heed, including King Casimir himself. He thought, "She is pretty, certainly, if somewhat thin and peaked. She has a solitary look about her. Perhaps she keeps too much to herself. Well, all this can be remedied. She will grow to be a desirable match." And Casimir, who ever more fervently yearned to restore the ancient grandeur of Lyonesse, went on to reflect, "It is certainly not too early to think along these lines." He cast his mind across the possibilities. Dehout was of course the great obstacle to his plans, and King Audrey was his dedicated if covert enemy. Someday the old war must continue, but rather than attack Dehout on the east through Pomperel, where Audrey's lines of operation were short, which had been King Fristen's grim mistake, Casimir hoped to attack through South Ulfland, to gnaw at Dehout's exposed western flanks, and King Casimir mused upon South Ulfland. King Oriente, a pallid, round-headed little man, was ineffectual, shrill, and waspish. He reigned at his castle Sveg, near the town Oaldus, but could not rule the fiercely independent barons of mountain and moor. His queen, Behus, was both tall and corpulent, and she had borne him a single son, Quilci, now 5 years old, somewhat lack-witted and unable to control the flow of saliva from his mouth. A match between Quilci and Suldrun could bring great advantage. Much depended upon Suldrun's ability to guide a feeble-minded spouse. If Quilci were as tractable as reports suggested, a clever woman should find no difficulty with him. Such were King Casimir's reflections as he stood in the great hall at the name-day of his son Cassander. Suldrun felt her father's eyes upon her. The intensity of his gaze made her uncomfortable, and for a moment she feared that she had aroused his disapproval. But presently he looked away, and to her relief paid her no more heed. Directly opposite sat the princelings from Trossenet. Truin was 14 years old, tall and strong for his age. His dark hair was cut low and square across the forehead, and hung thick at the sides past his ears. His features were perhaps a trifle heavy, but he was by no means ill-favored. Indeed, he already had made his presence felt among the housemaids at Zarkon, the manor house of Prince Arbamet, his father. His eyes rested often upon Suldrun, in a way she found disturbing. The second Troyes princeling was Ilus, 2 or 3 years younger than Truin. He was slender of hip and square in the shoulder. His straight, light brown hair was cropped into a cap covering the top of his ears. His nose was short and even. The line of his jaw showed clean and definite. He seemed not to notice Suldrun, which prompted in her an absurd little quiver of vexation, even though she had disapproved of the other prince's boldness. Her attention was distracted by the coming of 4 gaunt druid priests. They wore long robes of brown furs, belted and hooded to hide their faces, and each carried an oak branch from their sacred grove. They shuffled forward, their long white feet appearing and disappearing below the robes, and arranged themselves to north, south, east, and west of the cradle. The druid to the north held the oak branch over the child and touched his forehead with a wooden periapt, then spoke. "The Dagda blesses you and gives you the benefit of your name, Cassander." The druid to the west extended his oak branch. "Brigid, first daughter of the Dagda, blesses you and gives you the benefit of poetry, and names you Cassander." The druid to the south extended his oak branch. "Brigid, second daughter of the Dagda, blesses you and gives you the benefit of strong health and powers of healing, and calls you Cassander." The druid to the east extended his oak branch. "Brigid, third daughter of the Dagda, blesses you and gives you the benefit of iron in sword and shield, in sickle and plough, and calls you Cassander." All held their branches to form a leafy ceiling over the child. "May the light of Lug warm your body. May the dark of Ogma improve your prospects. May Lear support your ships. May the Dagda forever hold you in grace." They turned and moved on slow bare feet from the hall. Pages in scarlet puff pantaloons raised clarions and blew the Queen's honor. The company stood in murmurous near silence as Queen Solace retired on the arm of Lady Lenore, while Lady Desdia supervised the removal of the infant prince. Musicians appeared on the high gallery with dulcimer, pipes, lute, and a cadwal, this a single-stringed fiddle apt for the playing of jigs. The center of the hall was cleared, the pages blew a second fanfare, lo, the jocund king. King Casimir addressed himself to the Lady Oresme, Duchess of Slehan. The musicians produced a stately concord, and King Casimir led Lady Oresme forth for the pavane, followed by the lords and ladies of the realm, in a pageant of magnificent costumes of every color, with every gesture, every step, every bow and position of head, hand, and wrist ordained by etiquette. Suldrun watched in fascination. Slow step, pause, little bow and swing of the arms in graceful style, then another step, and shimmer of silk, the rustle of petticoats to the careful sonorities of the music. How stern and stately seemed her father, even engaged in the frivolity of dancing the pavane. The pavane ended, and the company removed to the Clod on Dock Nair, and found their places at the banquet table. The most rigid rules of precedence applied. The chief herald and an ordinator had worked with enormous pains, making the most subtle of discriminations. Suldrun was seated directly to the right of King Casimir, in that chair usually occupied by the Queen. Tonight Queen Solace was unwell, and lay in her bed, where she ate to repletion of sweet curd tarts, while Suldrun for the first time dined at the same table with her father the king. 3 months after the birth of Prince Cassander, the circumstances of Suldrun's life altered. Eherm, already mother to a pair of sons, gave birth to twins. Her sister, who had managed the household while Eherm was at the palace, married a fisherman, and Eherm could no longer serve Suldrun. Almost coincidentally, Dame Budetta announced that by the wishes of King Casimir, Suldrun must be schooled in deportment, dancing, and all other skills and graces appropriate to a royal princess. Suldrun resigned herself to the program, which was rendered by various ladies of the court. As before, Suldrun used the soporific hours of early afternoon to wander quietly abroad, out into the orangery, or the library, or the Hall of Honors. From the orangery the way led along an arcade, up to Zoltra's wall, through a vaulted tunnel, and out upon the Urquell. Suldrun ventured so far as the tunnel, and stood in the shadows watching the men-at-arms as they drilled with pikes and swords. They made a gallant spectacle, thought Suldrun, stamping, shouting, lunging forward, falling back. To the right a crumbling wall flanked the Urquell. Almost hidden behind a sprawling old larch, a heavy wooden door, desiccated with age, led through the wall. Suldrun slipped from the tunnel and into the shadows behind the larch. She peered through a crack in the door, then pulled at a bolt which held the warped timbers in place. She exerted all her strength, to no avail. She found a rock and used it as a hammer. The rivets parted, the bolt sagged aside. Suldrun pushed, the door creaked and shuddered. She turned around and bumped it with her round little buttocks. The door protested with an almost human voice and moved ajar. Suldrun squeezed through the gap and found herself at the head of a ravine, which seemed to descend all the way to the sea. Greatly daring, she ventured a few steps down an old path. She stopped to listen. No sound. She was alone. She went another 50 feet and came upon a small structure of weathered stone, now desolate and empty, apparently an ancient fane. Suldrun dared go no further. She would be missed, and Dame Budetta would scold her. She craned her neck to look down the ravine and glimpsed the foliage of trees. Reluctantly, she turned and went back the way she had come. An autumn storm brought 4 days of rain and mist to Lyonesse town, and Suldrun was pent within Hadion. On the 5th day the clouds broke, and shafts of sunlight struck down through the rents at various angles. By noon, the sky was half blue space, half hurrying cloud rack. At first opportunity, Suldrun ran up the arcade, through the tunnel under Zoltra's wall, then, after a precautionary glance around the Urquheel, under the larch and through the old wooden door. She closed the door behind her and stood tingling with a sense of isolation from all the rest of the world. She descended the old path to the fane, an octagonal stone structure perched on a stone shelf, with the ridge rising steeply behind. Suldrun looked through the low arched door. 4 long steps would take her to the back wall, where the symbol of Mithras overlooked a low stone altar. To each side, a narrow window admitted light. Slate tiles covered the roof. A drift of dead leaves had blown through the doorway, otherwise the fane was empty. The atmosphere carried a dank, clammy, sweet odor, faint but unpleasant. Suldrun twitched her nose and backed away. The ravine descended steeply. The ridges to either side assumed the semblance of low, irregular cliffs. The path angled this way and that, through stones, clumps of wild thyme, asphodel, and thistles, and out upon a terrace where the soil lay deep. 2 massive oaks, almost filling the ravine, stood sentinel over the ancient garden below, and Suldrun felt like an explorer discovering a new land. To the left, the cliff rose high. An irregular copse of yew, laurel, hornbeam, and myrtle shaded an undergrowth of shrubs and flowers, violets, ferns, harebells, forget-me-nots, anemones. Banks of heliotrope scented the air. On the right hand, the cliff, almost equally tall, trapped sunlight. Below grew rosemary, asphodel, foxglove, wild geranium, lemon verbena, slim black-green cypress, and a dozen enormous olive trees, gnarled, twisted, the fresh gray-green foliage in contrast with the age-worn trunks. Where the ravine widened, Suldrun came upon the ruins of a Roman villa. Nothing remained but a cracked marble floor, a half-toppled colonnade, a tumble of marble blocks among weeds and thistles. At the edge of the terrace grew a single old lime tree with a heavy trunk and sprawling boughs. Below, the path led down to a narrow beach of shingle, curving between a pair of capes where the cliffs on either hand thrust into the sea. The wind had eased to a near calm, but swells from the storm continued to bend around the headlands and break upon the shingle. For a time, Suldrun watched the sunlight sparkling on the sea, then turned and looked back up the ravine. The old garden doubtless was enchanted, she thought, with a magic evidently benign. She felt only peace. The trees basked in the sunlight and paid her no heed. The flowers all loved her, except the proud asphodel, which loved only itself. Melancholy memories stirred among the ruins, but they were insubstantial, less than wisps, and they had no voices. The sun moved across the sky. Suldrun reluctantly turned to go. She would be missed if she stayed longer. Up through the garden she went, out the old door, and back down the arcade to Hadeon. Chapter 3. Suldrun awoke to a cold gray room and a dismal wet light from outside her windows. The rains had returned, and the chambermaid had neglected to build up the fires. Suldrun waited a few minutes, then resignedly slid from her bed, and with shanks shivering to the chill, dressed herself and combed out her hair. The maid at last appeared, and hurriedly built the fires, fearful lest Suldrun might denounce her to Dame Budetta, but the lapse had already slipped from Suldrun's mind. She went to stand by the window. Rain blurred the panorama. The harbor was a rain puddle. The tiled roofs of the town were 10,000 shapes in many tones of gray. Where had the color gone? Color! What peculiar stuff! It glowed in the sunlight, but in the dimness of rain it faded. Most peculiar. Suldrun's breakfast arrived, and as she ate, she pondered the paradoxes of color. Red and blue, green and purple, yellow and orange, brown and black, each with its character and special quality, yet impalpable. Suldrun went down to the library for her lessons. Her tutor was now Master James, archivist, scholar, and librarian to the court of King Casimir. Suldrun had at first found him a daunting figure of severity and precision, for he was tall and thin, and a great thin beak of a nose gave him the look of a predatory bird. Master James was a few years past the first wild urgencies of youth, but not yet old nor even middle-aged. His coarse black hair was cut level, with his mid-forehead clear around the scalp to hang in a shelf over his ears. His skin was parchment pale, his arms and legs were long and as gaunt as his torso. Nevertheless, he carried himself with dignity, and even an odd, ungainly grace. He was sixth son to Sir Quincy of Hredick, an estate comprising 30 acres of stony hillside, and had gained nothing from his father but gentle birth. He resolved to teach Princess Suldrun with dispassionate formality, but Suldrun quickly learned how to charm and befuddle him. He fell hopelessly in love with her, though he pretended that the emotion was no more than easy tolerance. Suldrun, who was perceptive when she put her mind to it, saw through his attempts at airy detachment and took charge of the learning process, as when Master James frowned at her writing and said, "These A's and G's look quite alike. We must do them all over in a careful hand." "But the quill is broken." "Then sharpen it. Careful now, do not cut yourself. It is a knack you must learn." "Ooh, ow, ooh!" "Did you cut yourself?" "No, I was just practicing in case I did." "You need not practice. Cries of pain come quite easily and naturally." "How far have you traveled?" "What has that to do with cutting a quill?" "I wonder if the students in far places like Africa cut their quills differently." "As to that, I can't say." "How far have you traveled?" "Oh, not too far. I studied at the university in Avalon, and also at Metheglin. Once I visited Aquitaine." "What is the farthest place of the whole world?" That is hard to say. Cathay, the far side of Africa?" "That can't be the proper answer." "Oh? In that case, please instruct me." "There is no such place. Something farther always lies beyond." "Yes, perhaps so. Let me cut the quill. There, just so. Now, as to the A's and G's." On the rainy morning when Suldrun went into the library for lessons, she found Master James already on hand, with a dozen quills cut and ready. "Today," said Master James, "you must write your name in whole and full, and with such exquisite skill that I will exclaim in surprise." "I will do my best," said Suldrun. "These are beautiful quills." "Excellent indeed." "The plumes are all white." "I believe that is true." "This ink is black. I think black plumes would be better for black ink." "I don't think the difference is noticeable." "We could try white ink with these white plumes." "I have no white ink, nor yet black parchment, so now—" "Master James, this morning I wondered about colors. Where do they come from? What are they?" Master James blinked and tilted his head to the side. "Colors? They exist everywhere we see color." "But they come and go. What are they?" "Well, truthfully, I don't know." "How clever of you to ask the question. Red things are red, and green things are green, and that would seem to be that." Suldrun smilingly shook her head. "Sometimes, Master James, I think I know as much as you." "Do not reproach me. Do you see those books yonder?
Plato and Nessus and Rohan and Herodotus. I have read them all, and I have learned only how much I do not know." "What of the magicians? Do they know everything?" Master James slouched his awkward length back in his chair and gave up all hopes for a formal and correct atmosphere. He looked out the library window and presently said, "When I still lived at Hredick, I was little more than a lad, I became friendly with a magician." Glancing at Suldrun, he saw that he had captured her attention. "His name was Shimrod. One day I visited his house Trilda, and forgot all about time. Night came on, and I was far from home. Shimrod caught a mouse and changed it into a fine horse. 'Ride home at speed,' he told me. 'Do not dismount or touch the ground before your destination, for as soon as your foot touches ground, the horse is once more a mouse.' And so it was. I rode in style to the envy of those who saw me, and I took care to dismount behind the stable, so that none would know that I had been riding a mouse. Alas, we are wasting time." He straightened up in his chair. "Now then, take up your pen, dip ink, and inscribe me a good R, as you will need to write your name." "But you have not answered my question." "Do magicians know everything?" The answer is no. Now, the characters in a fine square hand. "Oh, Master James, today I am bored with writing. Teach me magic instead." "Ha! If I knew magic, would I be frowsting here at 2 florins a week? No, no, my princess. I have better schemes in mind. I would take 2 fine mice and change them to a pair of beautiful horses, and I would become a handsome young prince, not much older than you, and we would go riding away over hill and dale to a wonderful castle in the clouds, and there we would dine on strawberries and cream and listen to the music of harps and fairy bells. Alas, I know no magic. I am the wretched Master James, and you are sweet, mischievous Suldrun who won't learn her letters." "No," said Suldrun in sudden decision. "I'll work very hard so that I can read and write, and do you know why? So that I may learn magic, and you need only learn to catch mice." Master James uttered a queer, choked laugh. He reached across the table and took her 2 hands. "Suldrun, you already know magic." For a moment they smiled at each other. Then, in sudden embarrassment, Suldrun bowed her head over her work. The rains continued. Master James, walking abroad in the cold and wet, caught a fever and could not teach. No one troubled to notify Suldrun, and she went down to the library to find it empty. For a time she practiced writing, and looked through a leather-bound book brought down from Northumbria, illuminated with exquisite depictions of saints in landscapes wrought in vivid inks. At last Suldrun put the book aside and went out into the hall. The time was now mid-morning, and servants were busy in the long gallery. Undermaids polished the flagstones with beeswax and lambskin. A footman, stalking on 10-foot stilts, replenished the sconces with oil of nenuphar. From outside the palace, muffled by the intervening walls, came the blare of clarions, announcing the arrival of notables. Looking along the gallery, Suldrun saw them enter the reception hall. 3 grandees, stamping and shaking the rain from their garments. Footmen hastened forward to relieve them of their cloaks, helmets, and swords. From the side, a herald raised his voice to its most resonant pitch. "From the realm of Dehout, 3 noble personages. I declare their identities: Leonard, Duke of Mech, Milleflor, Duke of Cadwy and Josselm, Imfall, Marquis of the Celtic March." King Casimir stepped forward. Sirs, I give you welcome to Hadeon. The three grandees performed a ritual genuflection, bobbing their right knees toward the floor, rising to hold hands out from the sides with head and shoulders still bent. The circumstances indicated an occasion of formal but less than ceremonial import. King Casimir returned them a gracious wave of the hand. Sirs, for now I suggest that you make haste to your chambers, where warm fires and dry clothing will bring you comfort. In due course we will exchange our counsels. Sir Millefleur responded, Thank you, King Casimir. In truth, we are wet. The cursed rain has allowed us no respite. The visitors were ushered away. King Casimir turned down the gallery. He noticed Suldrun and stopped short. Then, what's this? Why are you not at lessons? Suldrun thought to gloss over Master James's absence from his duties. I have only just finished my work for the day. I can write all the characters well, and I can use them to make up words. This morning I read a great book about the Christians. Ah, so read you did, characters and all? Not all the characters, Father. They were uncial, and the language was Latin. I have trouble with both. But I scanned the pictures carefully, and Master James tells me that I am doing well. That is good to hear. Still, you must learn proper comportment and not go strolling up and down the gallery unattended. Suldrun spoke in apprehension. Father, sometimes I prefer to be alone. Casimir, faintly frowning, stood with feet apart and hands behind his back. He disliked opposition to his judgments, especially from a girl so small and inexperienced. In a measured voice intended to define the facts with exactitude and finality, he said, Your preference must on occasion yield to the forces of reality. Yes, Father. You must hold in mind your importance. You are the Princess Suldrun of Lyonesse. Soon the quality of the world will be coming to woo you in marriage, and you must not seem a hoyden. We want to pick and choose for the best advantage to yourself and the kingdom. Suldrun said uncertainly, Father, marriage is nothing I care to think about. Casimir narrowed his eyes. Again the hint of willfulness. In reply he used a voice of bluff jocularity. I should hope not. You are only just a child. Still, you are never too young to be conscious of position. Do you understand the word diplomacy? No, Father. It means dealing with other countries. Diplomacy is a delicate game, like a dance. Trossinet, de Hout, Lyonesse, the Scar and the Celts, all in pirouettes, all ready to join in threes or fours to deal the outsiders their death blow. I must ensure that Lyonesse is not excluded from the quadrille. Do you understand my meaning? Suldrun considered. I think so. I'm happy that I must not do any such dancing. Casimir stood back, wondering whether she might have perceived his meaning all too well. He said shortly, That's all for now. Be off with you to your proper quarters. I will speak to Lady Desdia. She will find you a suitable set of companions. Suldrun started to explain that she needed no new companions, but glancing up into King Casimir's face, she held her tongue and turned away. In order to obey King Casimir's command in its exact and literal sense, Suldrun ascended to her chambers in the east tower. Dame Maugolan sat snoring in a chair with her head thrown back. Suldrun looked out the window to discover the steady fall of rain. She thought a moment, then slipped past Dame Maugolan into her dressing room and changed into a frock woven from dark green linen. With a final demure over-the-shoulder glance toward Dame Maugolan, she left the chambers. King Casimir's order had been obeyed. If he chanced to see her, she could demonstrate as much by her change of garments. Daintily, step by step, she descended the stairs to the octagon.
Here she halted to look and listen. The long gallery was empty. No sound. She wandered an enchanted palace where everyone drowsed. Suldrun ran to the great hall. The gray light which managed to seep through the high windows was lost in the shadows. On silent feet, she went to a tall, narrow portal in the long wall, looked over her shoulder, mouth twitching up at the corners. She tugged open the massive door and slipped into the Hall of Honors. The light, as in the great hall, was gray and dim, and the solemnity of the chamber was enhanced. As always, 54 tall chairs ranged the walls to left and right, and all seemed to stare in brooding disdain at the table which, with 4 attendant and lesser chairs, had been placed at the center of the room. Suldrun surveyed the interloping furniture with equal disapproval. It intruded into the space between the tall chairs and impeded their easy intercourse. Why would anyone do so clumsy a deed? No doubt the arrival of the 3 grandees had dictated the arrangement. The thought stopped Suldrun in her tracks. She decided to depart the Hall of Honors at once, but not quickly enough. From outside the door, voices. Suldrun, startled, froze into a statue. Then she ran back and forth in confusion and finally darted behind the throne. At her back lay the dark red gonfalon. Suldrun slipped through the slit in the fabric into the storage room. By standing close to the hanging and twitching open the slit, Suldrun watched a pair of footmen enter the hall. Today they wore splendid ceremonial livery, scarlet puff pantaloons, black and red striped hose, black shoes with curled tips, ochre tabards embroidered with the tree of life. They paced around the room, setting alight the wall sconces. 2 other footmen carried in a pair of heavy black iron candelabra, which they set on the table. The candles, each 2 inches thick and molded from bayberry wax, were also set alight. Suldrun had never seen the Hall of Honors so resplendent. She began to feel annoyed with herself. She was the Princess Suldrun and need not hide from footmen. Still, she remained in concealment. News traveled quickly along the corridors of Hadeon. If the footmen saw her, soon Dame Maugelin would know, then Dame Budetta, and who knows how high the story might rise. The footmen completed their preparations and retired from the room, leaving the doors open. Suldrun stepped out into the chamber. Beside the throne she paused to listen, face slantwise, fragile and pale, alive with excitement. Suddenly bold, she ran out across the chamber. She heard new sounds, the jingle of metal, the tramp of heavy footsteps. In a panic, she turned and ran back behind the throne. Looking over her shoulder, she glimpsed King Casimir in full panoply of might and majesty. He marched into the Hall of Honors, head high, chin and short blonde beard jutting. The flames from the sconces reflected from his crown, a simple gold band under a circlet of silver laurel leaves. He wore a long black cape trailing almost to his heels, black and brown doublet, black trousers, black ankle boots. He carried no weapon and wore no ornament. His face, as usual, was cold and impassive. To Suldrun he seemed the embodiment of awful pomp. She dropped to her hands and knees and crawled under the gonfalon into the back room. Finally, she dared to stand erect and peer through the slit. King Casimir had failed to notice a twitching of the gonfalon. He stood by the table with his back to Suldrun, hands on the chair in front of him. Heralds entered the room, 2 by 2, to the number of 8, each bearing a standard displaying the Lyonesse tree of life. They took positions along the back wall. Into the room marched the 3 grandees who had arrived earlier in the day. King Casimir stood waiting until the 3 had separated to stand by their chairs, then seated himself, followed by his 3 guests. Stewards placed beside each man a silver chalice, which the chief steward filled with dark red wine from an alabaster pitcher. He then bowed and departed the room, and after him the footmen and then the heralds. The four sat alone at the table. King Casimir held aloft his chalice. I propose joy to our hearts, fulfillment to our needs, and success to those goals which we hold in mutuality. The four men drank wine. King Casimir said, Now then, to our affairs. We sit in informality and privacy. Let us speak in candor without restraint. Such a discussion will yield benefit to us all. We will take you at your word, spoke Sir Millefleur. He smiled a thin smile. Still, I doubt if our heart's desires run quite so closely in conjunction as you envision. Let me define a position which all of us must endorse, said King Casimir. I cite the memory of the olden times, when a single rule maintained a halcyon peace. Since then we have known incursions, pillage, war, and suspicion. The two Ulflands are poisonous wastes, where only the Scar, robbers, and wild beasts dare walk abroad. The Celts are suppressed only by dint of constant vigilance, as Sir Imphal will attest. I do so attest, said Sir Imphal. Then I will put the matter into simple terms, said King Casimir. Dehout and Lyonesse must work in concert. With this combined force under a single command, we can drive the Scar out of the Ulflands and subdue the Celts. Next, Dacinet, then Trosinet, and the Elder Isles are once more whole. First, the merging of our two lands. Sir Millefleur spoke. Your statements are beyond debate. We are halted by a set of questions. Who becomes preeminent? Who leads the armies? Who rules the realm? These are blunt questions, said King Casimir. Let the answers wait until we are agreed in principle. Then we will examine such possibilities. Sir Millefleur said, We are agreed on the principles. Let us now explore the real issues. King Audrey sits on the ancient throne of Andig. Will you concede his preeminence? I cannot do so. Still, we can rule in tandem as equals. Neither King Audrey nor Prince Dorcas are stern soldiers. I will command the armies. King Audrey shall conduct the diplomacy. Sir Leonard uttered a grim laugh. At the first difference of opinion, the armies might well overcome the diplomats. King Casimir also laughed. That condition need not arise. Let King Audrey rule supreme until his death. Then I will rule until my death. Prince Dorcas shall succeed me. In the event that he breeds no sons, Prince Cassander will be next in line. That is an interesting concept, said Sir Millefleur dryly. King Audrey is old, and you are relatively young. Need I remind you? Prince Dorcas might wait 30 years for his crown. Possibly so, said King Casimir without interest. King Audrey has instructed us, said Sir Millefleur. His anxieties are similar to yours, but he is wary of your notorious ambitions. He suggests that you would like Dehout to engage the Scar, thereby allowing you to attack Trosinet. King Casimir sat silent a moment, then stirred and spoke. Will Audrey agree to a joint effort against the Scar? He will indeed, if the armies are under his command. Has he no alternate proposals? He notes that the Princess Suldrun will soon arrive at marriageable age. He suggests the possibility of betrothal between Princess Suldrun and Prince Huimus of Dehout. King Casimir leaned back in his chair. Huimus is his third son? That is true, Your Majesty. King Casimir smiled and touched his short blonde beard. Let us rather unite his first daughter, the Princess Clore, with my nephew, Sir Nonus Roman. We will dutifully convey your suggestion to the court at Avalon. King Casimir drank from the chalice. The emissaries courteously drank as well. King Casimir looked from face to face. "Are you then merely messengers, or in truth can you negotiate?" Sir Millefleur said, "We may negotiate within the limits set by our instructions. Would you care to rephrase your proposal in the simplest way without euphemism?" King Casimir picked up the chalice in his 2 hands, held it to chin level, and turned his pale blue eyes over the top. "I propose that the assembled might of Lyonesse and Dehout, under my command, attack the Scaw and drive them back out across the Atlantic, and that next we subdue the Celts. I propose that we join our kingdoms, not only through cooperation, but also through marriage. Either Audrey or I will die first. The survivor shall thereupon rule the joint kingdoms, to be known as the Kingdom of the Elder Isles in the old fashion. My daughter, Princess Suldrun, shall marry the Prince Dorcas. My son, Prince Cassander, shall marry suitably. So much I propose." "The proposal has much in common with our position," said Sir Leonard. "King Audrey prefers that military operations conducted on the soil of Dehout be commanded by himself. Secondly—" The negotiations proceeded another hour, but only emphasized the mutual inflexibility. Since nothing more had been expected, the conversations ended on a polite basis. The envoys departed the Hall of Honors, that they might rest before the evening's banquet, while King Casimir remained brooding alone at the table. In the back room, Suldrun watched in fascination, then in panic, as King Casimir picked up one of the candelabra, turned, and with heavy steps walked toward the back chamber. Suldrun stood paralyzed. Her presence was known. She turned, darted to the side, ducked into the corner beside a storage case, and pulled a fragment of old rag over her shining hair. The hangings parted. Candlelight flickered through the chamber. Suldrun crouched, awaiting the voice of King Casimir. But he stood in silence, nostrils dilated, perhaps sensing the fragrance of the lavender sachet in which Suldrun's clothes were laid. He looked over his shoulder, then went to the back wall. From a crevice he took a thin iron rod, which he pushed into a small hole at the level of his knee, then into another somewhat higher. A door opened, emitting a light quivering and almost palpable, like a flickering alternation of purple and green. Out from the room flowed the trilling tingle of magic. A pair of high-pitched voices produced a babbling outcry. "Silence!" said King Casimir. He entered the room and closed the door. Suldrun jumped from the corner and departed the room. She ran across the Hall of Honors, slipped out into the great hall, and thence to the long gallery. Once more, she went sedately to her rooms, where Dame Maugolan scolded her for soiled clothes and a dirty face. Suldrun bathed, dressed in a warm robe. She went to the window with her lute and pretended to practice, making such energetic discords that Dame Maugolan threw up her hands and went elsewhere. Suldrun was left alone. She put the lute aside and sat looking across the landscape. The time was late afternoon. The weather had broken. Sunlight glistened on the wet roofs of Lyonesse town. Slowly, incident by incident, Suldrun reviewed the events of the day. The 3 envoys from Dehout interested her little, except that they wanted to take her away to Avalon and marry her to a strange man. Never! She would run away. She would become a peasant, or a minstrel girl, or gather mushrooms in the woods. The secret room behind the Hall of Honors in itself seemed neither extraordinary nor remarkable. In fact, it only corroborated certain of her half-formed suspicions regarding King Casimir, who wielded such absolute and awful power. Dame Maugolan returned to the room, panting in haste and excitement.
Your father commands you to the banquet. He wishes you to be everything a beautiful princess of Lyonesse should be. Do you hear? You may wear your blue velvet gown and your moonstones. At all times remember court etiquette. Don't spill your food, drink very little wine. Speak only when you are addressed, then respond with courtesy and without chewing your words. Neither titter, nor scratch yourself, nor wriggle in your chair as if your bottom itched. Do not belch, gurgle, or gulp. If someone breaks wind, do not stare or point or attempt to place the blame. Naturally, you will control yourself as well. Nothing is more conspicuous than a farting princess. Come, I must brush your hair. In the morning, Suldrun went to take her lessons in the library, but again Master James was not on hand, nor on the day after, nor the day after. Suldrun became a trifle miffed. Surely Master James might have communicated with her despite his indisposition. For an entire week she ostentatiously absented herself from the library, but still no word from Master James. In sudden alarm, Suldrun sought out Dame Budetta, who sent a footman to Master James's bleak little cell in the west tower. The footman discovered Master James outstretched and dead on his pallet. His fever had become pneumonia, and he had died, with no one the wiser. Chapter 4. One morning of the summer before Suldrun's 10th birthday, she went to the third-floor parlor in the squat old Tower of Owls for her dancing lesson. The room itself she thought perhaps the finest of all Hadean. A well-waxed birch parquetry floor reflected light from 3 windows draped with a pearl-gray satin. Furniture upholstered in pale gray and scarlet ranged the walls, and Mistress Laletta made sure that fresh flowers were to be found on all the tables. The students included 8 boys and 8 girls of high degree, ranging in age from 8 to 12. Suldrun judged them a mixed lot, some agreeable, others tiresome and dull. Mistress Laletta, a slender, dark-eyed young woman of gentle birth but few prospects, taught competently and showed no favoritism. Suldrun neither liked nor disliked her. On this morning, Mistress Laletta was indisposed and could not teach. Suldrun returned to her chambers to discover Dame Maugolan lying grandly naked on Suldrun's bed, mounted by a hearty young footman named Lopus. Suldrun watched in startled fascination until Dame Maugolan caught sight of her and uttered a horrified cry. "Disgusting!" said Suldrun. "And in my bed?" Lopus, sheepishly disengaging himself, drew on his breeches and departed. Dame Maugolan dressed herself no less hastily, meanwhile making jovial small talk. "Back so soon from dancing, my dear princess? Well then, did you have a good lesson? What you saw was nothing of moment, just a bit of play. Better, far better, if no one knew." Suldrun spoke in annoyance. "You've soiled my bed. Now then, dear princess, take all the bedding out. No, first go wash yourself, then bring in all clean bedding and air the room well." "Yes, dear princess." Dame Maugolan hastened to obey, and Suldrun ran off down the stairs with a lift of the spirits, a skip, and a gleeful laugh. Dame Maugolan's strictures might now be dismissed, and Suldrun could do as she pleased. Suldrun ran up the arcade, scanning the Urquheel to make sure that no one watched, then ducked under the old larch and thrust open the groaning old gate. She squeezed through, shut the gate, and descended the winding path, past the fane and into the garden. The day was bright and sunny. The air smelled sweet of heliotrope and fresh green leaves. Suldrun surveyed the garden with satisfaction. She had uprooted all those weeds she considered rank and crass, including all the nettles and most of the thistles. The garden now was almost orderly. She had swept leaves and dirt from the tessellated floor of the old villa, and had cleared detritus from the bed of a little stream which trickled down one side of the ravine. There was still much to do, but not today. Standing in the shadow of a column, she opened the clasp at her shoulder, let her gown drop around her ankles, and stepped away naked. Sunlight tingled on her skin. Cool air produced a delicious contrast of sensations. She moved down through the garden. Just so must a dryad feel, thought Suldrun. Just so must it move, in just such a hush, with no sound but the sigh of the wind in the leaves. She halted in the shade of the solitary old lime tree, then continued down to the beach to see what the waves had brought in. When the wind blew from the southwest, as was often the case, the currents swung around the headland and curled into her little cove, bringing all manner of stuff to the beach until the next high tide, when the same current lifted the articles and took them away once more. Today the beach was clean. Suldrun ran back and forth, skirting the surf as it moved along the coarse sand. She halted to scrutinize a rock 50 yards out under the headland, where she once had discovered a pair of young mermaids. They had seen her and called out, but they used a slow, strange language Suldrun could not understand. Their olive-green hair hung about their pale shoulders. Their lips and the nipples of their breasts were also a pale green. One waved, and Suldrun saw the webbing between her fingers. Both turned and looked offshore to where a bearded merman reared from the waves. He called out in a hoarse, windy voice. The mermaids slipped from the rocks and disappeared. Today the rocks were bare. Suldrun turned and walked slowly up into the garden. She dressed in her rumpled frock and returned to the top of the ravine. First a peek through the gateway to make sure no one watched, then quickly through and a run, hop, and skip back down the arcade, past the orangery, and once more into Hadean. A summer storm blowing in from the Atlantic brought a soft rain to Lyonesse town. Suldrun was confined to Hadean. One afternoon she wandered into the Hall of Honors. Hadean was quiet. The castle seemed to hold its breath. Suldrun walked slowly around the room, examining each of the great chairs as if to appraise its strength. The chairs in turn considered her. Some stood proud and aloof, others were surly. Some were dark and sinister, others benevolent. At the throne of King Casimir, Suldrun surveyed the dark red gonfalon, which concealed the back room. Nothing, she told herself, could induce her to venture within, not with magic so close. Stepping to the side, she evaded the purview of the throne and felt more at ease. There, not 10 feet from her face, hung the gonfalon. Naturally, she dared not enter, nor even approach the back room. Still, to look would cause no harm. On soft feet, she sidled close to the hanging and gently pulled it aside. Light from the high windows passed over her shoulders to fall on the far stone wall. There, in a crevice, the iron rod. There, the upper and lower lockholes. And beyond, the room where only King Casimir might go. Suldrun let the panels come together. She turned away and, in a sober mood, departed the Hall of Honors. Relations between Lyonesse and Trossinette, never warm, had become strained for a variety of reasons, which, trifle by trifle, acted to create hostility. The ambitions of King Casimir excluded neither Trossinette nor Dacinet, and his spies pervaded every level of Troyes society. King Casimir was handicapped in his program by the absence of a navy. Despite a long coastline, Lyonesse lacked easy access to the sea, with blue water ports only at Sloot Scheme, Bulmer Scheme, Lyonesse Town, and Pargetta behind Cape Farewell. The indented coast of Trossinette created dozens of sheltered harbors, each with piers, yards, and ways. There was an amplitude both of skilled shipwrights and good timber. hackberry and larch for knees, oak for frames, stands of young pinhead spruce for masts, and a dense resinous pine for planking. Troyes merchant ships ranged north to Jutland, Britain, and Ireland, south down the Atlantic to Mauritania and the kingdom of the Blue Men, east past Tingis and into the Mediterranean. King Casimir considered himself a master of intrigue and sought incessantly for some trifling advantage which he might exploit. On one occasion, a heavily laden Troyes cog, inching along the cast of Dacinet, in a dense fog ran aground on a sandbank. Ivar Excelsus, the irascible king of Dacinet, instantly claimed the vessel and its cargo, citing maritime law, and sent lighters to unload the cargo. A pair of Troyes warships appeared, repelled what was now a swarming flotilla of half-piratical Dace, and at high tide pulled the cog into deep water. In a fury, King Ivar Excelsus sent an abusive message to King Granus at Alcinor, demanding reparations, upon pain of punitive action. King Granus, who well knew the temperament of Ivar Excelsus, ignored the message, exasperating the Dace king almost to a state of incandescence. King Casimir now dispatched a secret emissary to Dacinet, urging attack upon Trossinet and promising full assistance. Troyes spies intercepted the envoy and took him with his documents to Alcinor. A week later, a cask was delivered to King Casimir at Hadion, in which he discovered the body of his envoy with the documents crammed into his mouth. Meanwhile, King Ivar Excelsus became distracted by another matter, and his threats against Trossinet came to nothing. King Granus made no further remonstrance to King Casimir, but began seriously to consider the possibility of an unwelcome war. Trossinet, with a population half that of Lyonesse, could never expect to win such a war, and hence had nothing to gain and everything to lose. From the town Pargetta, close by Cape Farewell, came ill reports of pillage and slaughter by the Ska. 2 black ships arriving at dawn discharged troops who looted the town with a dispassionate precision more terrifying than savagery. All who interfered were killed. The Ska took crocks of olive oil, saffron, wine, gold from the Mithric temple, tin and silver ingots, flasks of quicksilver. They took away no captives, put torches to no buildings, committed no rape or torture, and killed only those folk who impeded their robbery. 2 weeks later, a Troyes cog, putting into Lyonesse town with a cargo of Irish flax, reported a disabled Ska ship in the Sea of Tethra, west of Cape Farewell. The Troyes cog had put in close to discover 40 Ska sitting at their benches too weak to row. The Troyes had offered a tow, but the Ska refused to take a line, and the cog sailed away. King Casimir instantly dispatched 3 war galleys to the area, where they found the long black ship wallowing dismasted in the swells. The galleys drew up alongside to discover disaster, anguish, and death. A storm had broken the vessel's backstay, the mast had collapsed upon the forepeak, crushing the water casks, and half the ship's complement already had succumbed to thirst. 19 men survived. Too weak to offer resistance, they were taken aboard the Lyonesse ships and given water. A line was made fast to the long ship, the corpses were thrown overboard, and all returned to Lyonesse town, and the Ska were jailed in an old fort at the west end of the harbor. King Casimir, riding his horse Sheovan, went down to the harbor to inspect the longship. The contents of the forward and after cargo holds had been conveyed to the dock: a case of gold and silver temple adornments, glass jars of saffron gathered from the sheltered valleys behind Cape Farewell, pottery urns stamped with the symbol of the Bulmer Scheme Press. King Casimir inspected the loot and the longboat, then rowed Sheovan around the chale to the fortress. At his command, the prisoners were brought out and ranked before him to stand blinking into the sunlight. Tall, dark-haired men, pale of complexion, thin and sinewy rather than massive. They looked about them with the easy curiosity of honored guests and spoke to each other in soft, measured voices. King Casimir addressed the group. "Which among you is captain of the vessel?" The Ska turned to look at him, politely enough, but no one answered. King Casimir pointed to a man in the front rank. "Which man among you is in authority? Point him out." "The captain is dead." "We are all dead. Authority is gone, and everything else of life." "To me you appear quite alive," said Casimir, smiling coldly. "We reckon ourselves dead." "Because you expect to be killed? Suppose I allowed you ransom." "Who would ransom a dead man?" King Casimir made an impatient gesture. "I want information, not garble and cant." He looked through the group, and in one man, somewhat older than the others, thought to recognize the quality of authority. "You will remain here," he signaled the guards. "Take the others back to confinement." King Casimir took the man he had selected aside. "Are you also dead?" "I am no longer among the living Ska. To my family, my comrades, and myself, I am dead." "Tell me this. Suppose I wish to confer with your king. Would he come to Lyonesse under guarantees of protection?" "Naturally not." The Ska seemed amused. "Suppose I wish to explore the possibilities of an alliance." "To what end?" "The Ska Navy and the 7 Lyonesse armies acting in concert might be invincible." "Invincible? Against whom?" King Casimir disliked anyone who pretended to more acuity than himself. "Against all others of the Elder Isles. Whom else?" "You imagine the Ska assisting you against your enemies? The idea is preposterous. If I were alive, I would laugh. The Ska are at war with all the world, including Lyonesse." "That is no vindication. I am about to adjudge you a pirate." The Ska looked up at the sun, around the sky and out over the sea. "Do as you like. We are dead." King Casimir showed a grim smile. "Dead or not, your fate shall serve to daunt other murderers, and the time shall be noon tomorrow." Along the breakwater, 19 frames were erected. The night passed, the day dawned bright and clear. By mid-morning, crowds had assembled along the chail, including folk from coastal villages, peasants in clean smocks and bell hats, vendors of sausages and dried fish. On the rocks west of the chail crawled cripples, lepers, and the weak-minded, in accordance with the statutes of Lyonesse. The sun reached the zenith. The Ska were led from the fortress. Each was spread-eagled naked to a frame and hung upside down, facing out to sea. Down from the pain-hodder came Zurling, the chief executioner. He walked along the row, stopped by each man, slit the abdomen, drew out the intestines with a double-pronged hook so that they fell over the chest and head, then moved on to the next. A black and yellow flag was hoisted at the entrance to the harbor, and the dying men were left to themselves. Dame Maugolan pulled an embroidered bonnet over her head and went down to the chail. Suldrun thought that she might be left to herself, but Dame Budetta took her to the balcony outside the Queen's bedchamber, where ladies of the court gathered to watch the execution. At noon the conversations halted, and all pressed to the balustrade to view the proceedings. As Zurling went about his duties, the ladies sighed and made murmuring sounds. Suldrun was lifted to the balustrade the better that she might learn the fate accorded to outlaws. In fascinated revulsion,
she watched Zerling saunter from man to man, but distance concealed the details of his work. Few of the ladies present spoke favorably of the occasion. For Lady Dusain and Lady Ermely, who suffered poor vision, the distances were too great. Lady Spanice pronounced the affair simply dull. It was like butcher's work upon dead animals. The scar showed neither fear nor penitence. What kind of execution is that? Queen Solace grumbled. Worst of all, the wind blows directly across the harbor and into our windows. In 3 days the stink will drive us off to Saris. Suldrun listened in hope and excitement. Saris was the summer palace, some 40 miles to the east beside the river Glame. But there was no instant removal to Saris. Despite the inclinations of Queen Solace, the corpses were quickly scavenged by carrion birds. King Casimir became bored with the frames and the fragments of bone and gristle hanging at odd angles, and ordered the display dismantled. Hadeon was quiet. Dame Maugelan, suffering from swollen legs, lay moaning in her chamber, high in the Tower of Owls. Suldrun, alone in her room, became restless, but a blustering wind, raw and cold, dissuaded her from the secret garden. Suldrun stood looking from the window, troubled by a sweet, sad malaise. Oh, for a magic steed to carry her away through the air! How far she would fly, across the white clouds, over the land of the silver river, to the mountains at the edge of the world. For a breathless moment she thought how it would be to don her cloak, slip from the palace and be away, up the spur-arched to Old Street, with all the wide land before her. She sighed and smiled a wan smile for the folly of her fancies. The vagabonds she had seen from the parapets were by and large a disreputable lot, hungry and dirty, and sometimes rather crass in their habits. Such a life lacked appeal, and now, as she considered the matter, Suldrun decided that she very much enjoyed shelter from the wind and rain, and nice clean clothes, and the dignity of her person. If only she had a magic carriage, which at night became a little cottage where she could dine on the things she liked and sleep in a snug bed. She sighed once more. An idea came into her mind. She licked her lips at the audacity. Dared she? What harm could be done if she were extremely careful? She thought a moment, lips pursed and head tilted sideways, the definitive image of a girl planning mischief. At the hearth, Suldrun put flame to the candle in her night lamp and drew down the hood. Carrying the candle, she descended the stairs. The Hall of Honors was dim and dreary and quiet as the grave. Suldrun entered the chamber with exaggerated stealth. Today the great chairs gave her small attention. The unfriendly chairs maintained a stony reserve. The kind chairs seemed absorbed in their own affairs. Very well. Let them ignore her. Today she would ignore them as well. Suldrun went around the throne to the back wall, where she slid the hood from her candle. Just one look, that was all she intended. She was far too wise a girl to venture into danger. She pushed aside the hanging. Candlelight illuminated the room and the stone wall to the rear. Suldrun hurriedly found the iron rod. If she hesitated, her daring might desert her. Quick, then! She pushed the rod into the holes, bottom and top, and returned the iron to its place. The door shuddered open, releasing a plane of purple-green light. Suldrun moved a tentative step forward, no more than a peep or two. Wary now, and slow. Magic had its entrapments, so much she knew. She eased the door open. The room swam in layers of colored light, green, purple, persimmon red. To one side was a table supporting a peculiar instrument of glass and carved black wood. Flasks, bottles, and squat stoneware pots were ranged on shelves, as well as books, librams, touchstones, and mogrifiers. Suldrun came a cautious pace forward. A soft, throaty voice called out,
Who comes to see us? Quiet as a mouse, a nose at a time, with small white fingers and the smell of flowers?
A second voice said, "Come in, come in. Perhaps you will do a kind service to earn our blessings and our rewards." On the table, Suldrun saw a green glass bottle of a size to hold a gallon. The mouth fitted tightly about the neck of a double-headed homunculus, so that only its two small heads protruded. These were squat, no larger than cat size, with wrinkled, bald pates, snapping black eyes, a nose and oral apparatus of tough brown horn. The body was obscured by the glass and a dark liquid, like strong beer. The heads craned to look at Suldrun, and both spoke,
"Ah, what a pretty girl!
and kind-hearted as well."
Yes, that's Princess Suldrun. Already she is known for good works.
Have you heard how she nursed a little sparrow back to its health?
Come a bit closer, my dear, so that we may enjoy your beauty."
Suldrun remained where she stood. Other objects claimed her attention, but all seemed curio and items to excite amazement rather than functional equipment. An urn exuded the colored light which like a liquid flowed down or drifted up to its proper level. On the wall hung an octagonal mirror in a frame of tarnished wood. Farther along, pegs supported a quasi-human skeleton of black bones, slender as withes. From the shoulder blades protruded a pair of curving pinions, punctured with dozens of sockets, from which might have grown feathers or scales. The skeleton of a demon? Looking into the eye sockets, Suldrun felt an eerie conviction that the creature had never flown the air of Earth. The imps called out in hearty tones,
"Suldrun, beautiful princess, step forward. Give us the benefit of your presence."
Suldrun moved a step farther into the room. She bent to examine a plumb bob suspended over a dish of roiling quicksilver. On the wall above a leaden tablet displayed a set of crabbed black characters, which altered as she watched. A remarkable object indeed. Suldrun wondered what the characters portended. They were like none she had seen before. A voice issued from the mirror, and Suldrun saw that a lower section of the frame had been shaped to represent a wide mouth, curled up at the corners. The characters read thus: "Suldrun, sweet Suldrun, leave this room before harm arrives upon you." Suldrun looked about her. "What would harm me?" "Let the bottled imps clamp your hair or your fingers, and you will learn the meaning of harm." The two heads spoke at the same time.
"What a wicked remark! We are as faithful as doves.
Oh, it is bitter to be maligned when we cannot seek redress for the wrong."
Suldrun shrank even farther to the side. She turned to the mirror.
"Who is it that is speaking?"
"Persilian."
"You are kind to warn me."
"Perhaps. Perversity moves me from time to time." Suldrun came cautiously forward.
"May I look in the mirror?"
"Yes, but be warned. What you see you may not like." Suldrun paused to reflect. What might she not wish to see? If anything, the concept twitched at her curiosity. She slid a three-legged stool across the room and climbed upon it, so that she looked into the mirror.
"Persilian, I see nothing. It is like looking into the sky."
The surface of the mirror moved. For an instant, a face looked into her own, a man's face. Dark hair curled down past a flawless complexion, fine eyebrows curved over lustrous dark eyes. A straight nose complemented a full, supple mouth. The magic faded. Suldrun again stared into a void.
In a thoughtful voice she asked, "Who was that?" "If ever you meet him, he will pronounce his name. If you see him never again, then his name will serve you no purpose." "Priscillian, you mock me." "Perhaps. From time to time I demonstrate the inconceivable, or mock the innocent, or give truth to liars, or shred the poses of virtue, all as perversity strikes me. Now I am silent. This is my mood." Suldrun climbed down from the stool, blinking at tears which had come to her eyes. She felt confused and depressed. The two-headed goblin suddenly stretched one of its necks and with its beak seized at Suldrun's hair. It caught only a few strands, which it snatched out by the roots. Suldrun stumbled from the room. She started to close the door, then remembered her candle. She ran back into the room, snatched the candle, and left. The jeering cries of the two-headed goblin were muffled by the closing of the door. Chapter 5. On the day of Beltane, in the spring of the year following Suldrun's 11th birthday, occurred the ancient rite known as Blodfad, or coming into flower. With 23 other girls of noble lineage, Suldrun stepped through a circlet of white roses, and then led a pavane with Prince Belath of Cadiz for a partner. Belath, at the age of 16 years, was spare rather than sturdy. His features were crisp, well-shaped, if somewhat austere. His manners were precisely correct and pleasantly modest. In certain qualities he reminded Suldrun of someone else she had known. Who could it be? She searched her mind in vain. As she stepped the careful measures of the pavane, she studied his face to discover that he was giving her a similar scrutiny. Suldrun had decided that she liked Belath. She laughed self-consciously. "Why do you watch me so intently?" Belath asked half apologetically. "Shall I tell you the truth?" "Of course." "Very well, but you must control your anguish. I have been told that you and I are eventually to marry." Suldrun could find nothing to say. In silence they performed the stately evolutions of the dance. Belath finally spoke in anxiety. "I hope that you are not disturbed by what I said." "No, I must marry one day, so I suppose I am not ready to think about it." Later that night, as she lay in her bed considering the events of the day, Suldrun recalled of whom Prince Belath reminded her. It was none other than Master James. Blodfad brought changes to Suldrun's life. Despite her inclinations, she was moved from her dear and familiar chambers in the East Tower to more commodious quarters on the next floor below, and Prince Casimir moved into Suldrun's old rooms. 2 months previously, Dame Maugelin had died of the dropsy. Her place was taken by a seamstress and a pair of maids. To Dame Budetta was given supervision of Prince Casimir. The new archivist, a wizened little pedant named Julius Sagamundus, became Suldrun's instructor in orthography, history, and calculation with numbers. For the enhancement of her maidenly graces, Suldrun was given into the charge of the Lady Desdia, widow of Queen Solace's brother, who resided permanently at Hadean and performed genteel duties at the languid behest of Queen Solace. 40 years old, without property, large-boned, tall, with over-large features and bad breath, Lady Desdia had no prospects whatever. Still, beguiling herself with impossible fantasies, she primped, powdered, and perfumed herself. She dressed her chestnut hair in high style, with a complicated bun at the back and twin sponsons of crisp curls confined in nets over her ears. Suldrun's fresh young beauty and easy absent-minded habits rasped the most sensitive fibers of Lady Desdia's disposition. Suldrun's visits to the old garden had now become generally known. Lady Desdia automatically disapproved.
For a high-born maiden, or any other kind of maiden, the desire for privacy was not only eccentric, it was absolutely suspicious. Suldrun was somewhat too young to have taken to herself a lover, and yet the idea was absurd. Her breasts were but nubbins. Still, might she have been beguiled by a faun, who were known to be partial to the tart, sweet charms of young maidens? So went Lady Desdia's thinking. One day she blandly suggested that Suldrun escort her through the garden. Suldrun tried to evade the issue. "You wouldn't like the place. The path goes over rocks, and there is nothing much to see." "Still, I think I would like to visit this place." Suldrun studiously said nothing, but Lady Desdia persisted. "The weather is fine. Suppose we take our little walk now." "You must excuse me, my lady," said Suldrun politely. "This is a place where I go only when I am alone." Lady Desdia raised high her thin chestnut eyebrows. "Alone? It is not seemly that young ladies of your place should wander alone through remote areas." Suldrun spoke in a placid and off-hand manner, as if enunciating a known truth. "There is no harm in enjoying one's private garden." Lady Desdia could find nothing to say. Later she reported Suldrun's obstinacy to Queen Solace, who at the moment was testing a new pomade formulated from the wax of lilies. "I've heard something of this," said Queen Solace, rubbing a gobbet of white cream along her wrist. "She is a strange creature. At her age I had eyes for several gallant lads, but as for Suldrun, such ideas never enter her odd little head. Ha! This offers a rich scent. Feel the unction." On the next day the sun shone fair among small, high cloud tufts. Reluctantly to her lessons with Julius Sagamundus went Suldrun, wearing a prim little lavender and white striped gown gathered high up under her breasts and trimmed with lace at hem and collar. Perched on a stool, Suldrun dutifully wrote the ornate Lyonesse script with a gray goose quill, so fine and long that the tip twitched a foot above her head. Suldrun found herself gazing out the window ever more frequently, and the characters began to straggle. Julius Sagamundus, seeing how the wind blew, sighed once or twice, but without emphasis. He took the quill from Suldrun's fingers, packed his exercise books, quills, inks, and parchments, and went off about his own affairs. Suldrun climbed down from the stool and stood rapt by the window as if listening to far music. She turned and left the library. Lady Desdia emerged into the gallery from the green parlor, where King Casimir had instructed her in careful detail. She was only just in time to notice the lavender and white flutter of Suldrun's dress as she disappeared into the octagon. Lady Desdia hurried after, heavy with King Casimir's instructions. She went into the octagon, looked right and left, then went outside to glimpse Suldrun already at the end of the arcade. "Ah, Miss Slyboots," said Lady Desdia to herself, "now we shall see, but presently. She tapped her mouth with her finger, then went up to Suldrun's chambers, and there put inquiries to the maids. Neither knew Suldrun's whereabouts. "No matter," said Lady Desdia. "I know where to find her. Now then, lay out her pale blue afternoon gown with the lace bodice, and all to match, and draw her a bath." Lady Desdia descended to the gallery, and for half an hour sauntered here and there. At last she turned back up the long gallery. "Now," she told herself, "now we shall see." She ascended the arcade and passed through the tunnel out upon the parade ground. To her right, wild plum and larch shadowed an old stone wall, in which she spied a dilapidated timber door. She marched forward, ducked under the larch, pushed open the door. A path led away and down through juts and shoulders of rock. Clutching skirts above ankles, Lady Desdia picked her way down irregular stone steps, which angled first right, then left, past an old stone fane. She proceeded, taking great care not to stumble and fall, which would certainly compromise her dignity. The walls of the ravine spread apart. Lady Desdia overlooked the garden. Step by step she descended the path, and were she not so alert for mischief, she might have noticed the banks of flowers and pleasant herbs, the small stream flowing into artful pools, then tinkling down from stone to stone and into yet another pool. Lady Desdia saw only an area of rocky wasteland, uncomfortable of access, dank and unpleasantly isolated. She stumbled, hurt her foot, and cursed, angry at the circumstances which had brought her so far from Hadean. And now she saw Suldrun, 30 feet along the path, quite alone. As Lady Desdia had known she must be, she had only hoped for scandal. Suldrun heard the steps and looked up. Her eyes glowed blue in a face pale and furious. Lady Desdia spoke peevishly. "I've hurt my foot on the stones. It's truly a shame." Suldrun's mouth moved. She could not find words to express herself. Lady Desdia heaved a sigh of resignation and pretended to look around her. She spoke in a voice of whimsical condescension. "So, my dear princess, this is your little retreat." She gave an exaggerated shudder, hunching her shoulders. "Aren't you at all sensitive to the air? I feel such a dank waft. It must come from the sea." Again she looked about her, mouth pursed in amused disapproval. "Still, it's a wild little nook, like the world must have been before men appeared. Come, child, show me about." Fury contorted Suldrun's face, so that teeth showed through her clenched mouth. She raised her hand and pointed. "Go! Go away from here!" Lady Desdia drew herself up. "My dear child, you are rude. I am only concerned with your welfare, and I do not deserve your spite." Suldrun spoke wildly. "I don't want you here. I don't want you around me at all. Go away!" Lady Desdia stood back, her face an ugly mask. She seethed with conflicting impulses. Most urgently, she wanted to find a switch, lift the impudent child's skirt, and lay 6 goodly stripes across her bottom, an act in which she dared not indulge herself. Backing away a few steps, she spoke in dreary reproach. "You are the most ungrateful of children. Do you think it pleasure to instruct you in all that is noble and good, and guide your innocence through the pitfalls of the court when you fail to respect me? I look for love and trust. I find rancor. Is this my reward? I struggle to do my duty. I am told to go away." Her voice became a ponderous drone. Suldrun turned half away and gave her attention to the flight of a rock swallow, then another. She watched ocean swells crashing through the offshore rocks, then come twinkling and foaming up to her beach. Lady Desdia spoke on. "I must make clear, not for my benefit do I clamber through rock and thistle to notify you of duties such as today's important reception, as I now have done. No, I must accept the role of meddlesome Lady Desdia. You have been instructed, and I can do no more." Lady Desdia swung around her haunches, trudged up the path, and departed the garden. Suldrun watched her go with brooding gaze. There had been an indefinable air of satisfaction in the swing of her arms and the poise of her head. Suldrun wondered what it meant. The better to protect King Dual of Pomperol and his retinue from the sun, a canopy of red and yellow silk, the colors of Pomperol, had been erected across the great courtyard at Hadean. Under this canopy, King Casimir, King Dual, and various persons of high degree came to take their pleasure at an informal banquet. King Duel, a thin, sinewy man of middle years, carried himself with mercurial energy and zest. He had brought only a small entourage, his only son, Prince Kestrel, 4 knights, sundry aides, and lackeys, so that, as King Duel expressed it, "We are free as birds, those blessed creatures who soar the air to go where we wish at our own speed and pleasure." Prince Kestrel had achieved his 15th year and resembled his father only in his ginger-colored hair. Otherwise, he was staid and phlegmatic, with a fleshy torso and a placid expression. King Casimir nonetheless thought of Kestrel as a possible match for the Princess Suldrun, if options more advantageous were not open, and so arranged that a place for Suldrun be laid at the banquet table. When the place remained vacant, King Casimir spoke sharply aside to Queen Solace. "Where is Suldrun?" Queen Solace gave her marmoreal shoulders a slow shrug. "I can't say. She is unpredictable. I find it easiest to leave her to her own devices." "All well and good. Nevertheless, I commanded her presence." Queen Solace shrugged once more and reached for a sugar plum. "In that case, Lady Desdia must inform us." King Casimir looked over his shoulder to a footman. "Bring here the Lady Desdia." King Duel, meanwhile, enjoyed the antics of trained animals, which King Casimir had ordained for his pleasure. Bears in blue cocked hats tossed balls back and forth. 4 wolves in costumes of pink and yellow satin danced a quadrille. 6 herons with as many crows marched in formation. King Duel applauded the spectacle, and was especially enthusiastic in regard to the birds. "Splendid! Are they not worthy creatures, stately and wise? Notice the grace of their marching. A pace, so, another pace, just so." King Casimir acknowledged the compliment with a stately gesture. "I take it that you are partial to birds." "I consider them remarkably fine. They fly with an easy courage and a grace far exceeding our own capabilities." "Exactly true. Excuse me, I must have a word with Lady Desdia." King Casimir turned aside. "Where is Suldrun?" Lady Desdia feigned puzzlement. "Is she not here? Most odd. She is stubborn, and perhaps a bit wayward, but I cannot believe her to be willfully disobedient." "Where is she, then?" Lady Desdia made a facetious grimace and waved her fingers. "As I say, she is a headstrong child, and given to vagaries. Now she has taken a fancy to an old garden under the Urquell. I have tried to dissuade her, but she makes it her favored resort." King Casimir spoke brusquely. "And she is there now, unattended?" "Your Majesty, she permits no one in the garden but herself, or so it would seem. I spoke to her and communicated your Majesty's wishes. She would not listen and sent me away. I assume she remains still in the garden." King Duel sat enthralled by the performance of a trained ape walking a tightrope. King Casimir murmured an excuse and strode away. Lady Desdia went about her own affairs with a pleasant sense of achievement. King Casimir had not set foot in the old garden for 20 years. He descended along a path paved with pebbles set into sand, among trees, herbs, and flowers. Halfway to the beach, he came upon Suldrun. She knelt in the path, working pebbles into the sand. Suldrun looked up without surprise. King Casimir silently surveyed the garden, then looked down at Suldrun, who slowly rose to her feet. King Casimir spoke in a flat voice. "Why did you not heed my orders?" Suldrun stared in slack-jawed puzzlement. "What orders?" "I required your attendance upon King Duel of Pomperol and his son Prince Kestrel." Suldrun cast back into her memory, and now recovered the echo of Lady Desdia's voice. Squinting off toward the sea, she said, "Lady Desdia might have said something. She talks so much that I seldom listen." King Casimir allowed a wintry smile to enliven his face. He also felt that Lady Desdia spoke at unnecessary length. Once more he inspected the garden. "Why do you come here?" Suldrun said haltingly, "I am alone here. No one troubles me." "But are you not lonely?" "No. I pretend that the flowers talk to me." King Casimir grunted. Such fancies in a princess were unnecessary and impractical. Perhaps she was indeed eccentric. "Should you not entertain yourself among other maids of your station?" "Father, I do so at my dancing lessons." King Casimir examined her dispassionately. She had tucked a small white flower into her gleaming, dusty gold hair. Her features were regular and delicate. For the first time, King Casimir saw his daughter as something other than a beautiful, absent-minded child. "Come along," he said gruffly. "We shall go at once to the reception. Your costume is far from adequate, but neither King Duel nor Kestrel will think the worse of you." He noticed Suldrun's melancholy expression. "Well then, are you reluctant for a banquet?" "Father, these are strangers. Why must I meet them today?" "Because in due course you must marry, and Kestrel might be the most advantageous match." Suldrun's face fell even further. "I thought that I was to marry Prince Belath of Cadiz." King Casimir's face became hard. "Where did you hear that?" "Prince Belath told me himself." King Casimir voiced a harsh laugh. 3 weeks ago, Belath became betrothed to Princess Mehave of Dehaut." Suldrun's mouth sagged. "Is she not already a grown woman?" "She is 19 years old, and ill-favored to boot, but no matter. He obeyed his father the king, who chose Dehaut over Lyonesse, to his great folly, as he will learn. So, you became fond of Belath." "I liked him well enough." "It's of no consequence now. We need both Pomperol and Cadiz. If we make a match with Duel, we'll have them both. Come along, and mind you, show courtesy to Prince Kestrel." He turned on his heel. Suldrun followed him up the path on laggard feet. At the reception, she was seated beside Prince Kestrel, who practiced lofty airs upon her. Suldrun failed to notice. Both Kestrel and the circumstances bored her. In the autumn of the year, King Quart of Cadiz and Prince Belath went to hunt in the long hills. They were set upon by masked bandits and killed. Cadiz was thereby plunged into confusion, foreboding, and doubt. In Lyonesse, King Casimir discovered a claim to the throne of Cadiz, stemming from his grandfather, Duke Cassander, brother to Queen Lydia of Cadiz. The claim, based upon the flow of lineage from sister to brother, thence to a descendant twice removed, while legal, with qualifications, in Lyonesse, and also in the Ulflands, ran counter to the strictly patrilineal customs of Dehaut. The laws of Cadiz itself were ambiguous. The better to press his claim, Casimir rode to Montreuch, capital of Cadiz, at the head of 100 knights, which instantly aroused King Audrey of Dehaut. He warned that under no circumstances might Casimir so easily annex Cadiz to his crown, and began to mobilize a great army. The dukes and earls of Cadiz, thus emboldened, began to express distaste for Casimir, and many wondered, ever more pointedly, as to the identity of bandits so swift, so deadly, and so anonymous in a countryside ordinarily so placid. Casimir saw the way the wind was blowing. One stormy afternoon, as the nobles of Cadiz sat in conclave, a weird woman dressed in white entered the chamber holding high a glass vessel which exuded a flux of colors, swirling behind her like smoke. As if in a trance, she picked up the crown, set it on the head of Duke Thurlock, husband to Etain, younger sister to Casimir. The woman in white departed the chamber and was seen no more. After some contention, the omen was accepted at face value, and Thurlock was enthroned as the new king. Casimir rode home with his knights, satisfied that he had done all possible to augment his interests, and indeed his sister Ete, now queen of Cadiz, was a woman of redoubtable personality. Suldrun was 14 years old and marriageable. The rumor of her beauty had traveled far, and to Hadean came a succession of young grandees, and others not so young, to judge the fabulous Princess Suldrun for themselves. King Casimir extended to all an equal hospitality, but was in no hurry to encourage a match until all of his options were clear to him. Suldrun's life became increasingly complex, what with balls and banquets, fetes and follies. Some of the visitors she found pleasing, others less so. King Casimir, however, never asked her opinion, which in any case was of no interest to him. A different sort of visitor arrived at Lyonesse town, Brother Umfrid, a portly, round-faced evangelist, originally from Aquitania, who had arrived at Lyonesse by way of Wanish Isle and the diocese of Scrow. With an instinct as certain and sure as that which takes a ferret to the rabbit's throat, Brother Umfrid found the ear of Queen Solace. Brother Umfrid used an insistent, mellifluous voice, and Queen Solace became a convert to Christianity. Brother Umfrid established a chapel in the Tower of Palaemon, only a few steps from Queen Solace's chambers. At Brother Umfrid's suggestion, Cassander and Suldrun were baptized and required to attend early morning mass in the chapel. Brother Umfrid attempted next to convert King Casimir, and far overstepped himself. "Exactly what is your purpose here?" demanded King Casimir. "Are you a spy for Rome?" "I am a humble servant of the one and all-powerful God," said Brother Umfrid. "I carry his message of hope and love to all folk, despite hardship and tribulation. No more." King Casimir uttered a derisive laugh. "What of the great cathedrals at Avalon and Tassiel? Did God supply the money? No, it was milked from peasants." "Your Majesty, humbly we accept alms." "It would seem far easier for all-powerful God to create the money. No further proselytizing. If you accept a single farthing from anyone in Lyonesse, you will be whipped from here to Port Fader and shipped back to Rome in a sack." Brother Umfrid bowed with visible resentment. "It shall be as you command." Suldrun found Brother Umfrid's doctrines incomprehensible and his manner overfamiliar. She stopped attending Mass and so incurred her mother's displeasure. Suldrun found little time for herself. Noble maidens attended most of her waking hours, to chatter and gossip, to plan small intrigues, to discuss gowns and manners, and to analyze the persons who came courting to Hadean. Suldrun found little solitude and few occasions to visit the old garden. Early one summer morning the sun shone so sweetly, and the thrush sang such plaintive songs in the orangery, that Suldrun felt impelled to leave the palace. She pretended indisposition to avoid her maids-in-waiting, and furtively, lest someone notice and suspect a lover's tryst, she ran up the arcade, through the old portal, and into the garden. Something had changed. She felt as if she were seeing the garden for the first time, even though every detail, every tree and flower was familiar and dear. She looked about her in sadness for the lost vision of childhood. She saw evidence of neglect. Harebells, anemones, and violets growing modestly in the shade had been challenged by insolent tufts of rank grass. Opposite, among the cypresses and olive trees, nettles had risen more proudly than the asphodel. The path she had so diligently paved with beach pebbles had been broken by rain. Suldrun went slowly down to the old lime tree, under which she had passed many dreaming hours. The garden seemed smaller. Ordinary sunlight suffused the air rather than the old enchantment which had gathered in this place alone, and surely the wild roses had given a richer fragrance when first she had entered the garden. At a crunch of footsteps she looked about to discover a beaming Brother Umfrid. He wore a brown cassock tied with a black cord. The cowl hung down between his plump shoulders. His tonsured baldness shone pink. Brother Umfred, after a quick glance to left and right, bowed and clasped his hands before him. "Blessed princess, surely you have not come so far without escort?" "Exactly so, since I have come here for solitude." Suldrun's voice was devoid of warmth. "It pleases me to be alone." Brother Umfred, still smiling, again surveyed the garden. "This is a tranquil retreat. I, too, enjoy solitude. Is it possible that we two are cut from the same cloth?" Brother Umfred moved forward, halting no more than a yard from Suldrun. "It is a great pleasure to find you here. I have long wanted to talk to you in all earnestness." Suldrun spoke in an even colder voice. "I do not care to talk to you or anyone else. I came to be alone." Brother Umfred gave a wry, jocular grimace. "I will go at once. Still, do you think it proper to venture alone into a place so secluded? How tongues would wag were it known. All would wonder whom you favored with such intimacy." Suldrun turned her back in icy silence. Brother Umfred performed another comical grimace, shrugged, and ambled back up the path. Suldrun seated herself beside the lime tree. Brother Umfred, so she suspected, had gone up to wait among the rocks, hoping to discover who came to keep rendezvous. At last she arose and started back up the path. The outrage of Brother Umfred's presence had restored something of the garden's charm, and Suldrun stopped to pull weeds. Perhaps tomorrow morning she would come to uproot the nettles. Brother Umfred spoke to Queen Solace and made a number of suggestions. Solace reflected, then, in a spirit of cold and deliberate malice. She had long decided that she did not particularly care for Suldrun. She gave appropriate orders. Several weeks passed before Suldrun, despite her resolution, returned to the garden. Upon passing through the old timber door, she discovered a gang of masons at work upon the old fane. They had enlarged the windows, installed a door, and broken open the back to expand the interior, and had added an altar. In consternation, Suldrun asked the master mason, "What are you building here?" "Your Highness, we build a churchlet, or a chapel, as it might be called, that the Christian priest may conduct his rituals." Suldrun could hardly speak. "But who gave such orders?" "It was Queen Solace herself, Your Highness, for her ease and convenience during her devotions." Chapter 6. Between Dacinet and Trosinet was Scola, an island of crags and cliffs 20 miles across, inhabited by the Skills. At the center, a volcanic peak, Crow, reminded all of its presence with an occasional rumbling of the guts, a wisp of steam, or a bubble of sulfur. From Crow radiated 4 steep ridges, dividing the island into 4 duchies: Sadirax to the north, Corso to the east, Rhamnanthus to the south, and Malvang to the west, nominally ruled by dukes who in turn gave fealty to King Ivar Excelsis of Dacinet. In practice, the Skills, a dark, crafty race of unknown origin, were uncontrollable. They lived isolated in mountain glens, emerging only when the time came for dreadful deeds. Vendetta, revenge, and counter-revenge ruled their lives. The Skills' virtues were stealth, reckless elan, bloodlust, and stoicism under torment. His word, be it promise, guarantee, or threat, might be equated with certainty. Indeed, the Skills' exact adherence to his pledge often verged upon the absurd. From birth to death, his life was a succession of murders, captivities, escapes, wild fights, daring rescues, deeds incongruous in a landscape of Arcadian beauty. On days of festival, truce might be called. Then merrymaking and reveling exceeded rational bounds. Everything was to excess. Tables groaned under the weight of food. Fabulous feats of wine drinking were performed. There was passionate music and wild dancing. In sudden spasms of sentiment, ancient enmities might be resolved and feuds of 100 murders put to rest. Old friendships were made whole amid tears and reminiscences. Beautiful maidens and gallant lads met and loved, or met and parted. There was rapture and despair, seductions and abductions, pursuits, tragic deaths, virtue blighted and fuel for new vendettas. The clansmen along the west coast, when the mood came on them, crossed the channel to Trossonnet, where they performed mischiefs, including pillage, rape, murder, and kidnap. King Granus had long and often protested the acts to King Ivar Excelsis, who replied in effect that the incursions represented little more than youthful exuberance. He implied that in his opinion the better part of dignity was simply to ignore the nuisances, and that, in any event, King Ivar Excelsis knew no practical method of abatement. Port Mel, at the eastern tip of Trossonnet, each year celebrated the summer solstice with a 3-day festival and a grand pageant. Retherd, the young and foolish Duke of Malvang, in the company of 3 roistering friends, visited the festival incognito. At the grand pageant, they agreed that the maidens who represented the 7 graces were remarkably charming, but could form no consensus as to which was supreme. They discussed the matter well into the evening over wine, and at last, to resolve the matter in a practical way, kidnapped all 7 of the maidens and took them across the water to Malvang. Duke Retherd was recognized, and the news swiftly reached King Granus. Wasting no time in a new complaint to King Ivar Excelsis, King Granus landed an army of 1,000 warriors on Skola, destroyed Retherd's castle, rescued the maidens, gelded the duke and his cronies, then, for good measure, burned a dozen coastal villages. The 3 remaining dukes assembled an army of 3,000 and attacked the Troyes encampment. King Granus had secretly reinforced his expeditionary army with 200 knights and 400 heavy cavalry. The undisciplined clansmen were routed. The 3 dukes were captured, and King Granus controlled Skola. Ivar Excelsis issued an intemperate ultimatum. King Granus must withdraw all troops, pay an indemnity of 100 pounds of gold, rebuild Malvang Castle, and put a bond of another 100 pounds of gold to ensure no further offenses against the kingdom of Dacinet. King Granus not only rejected the ultimatum, but decreed annexation of Skola to Trossonnet. King Ivar Excelsis raged, expostulated, then declared war. He might not have acted so strongly had he not recently signed a treaty of mutual assistance with King Casimir of Lyonesse. At the time, King Casimir had thought only to strengthen himself for his eventual confrontation with Dehout, never expecting to be embroiled in trouble not of his own choosing, especially a war with Trossonnet. King Casimir might have extricated himself by one pretext or another, had not the war, upon due reflection, seemed to promise advantage. King Casimir weighed all aspects of the situation. Allied with Dacinet, he might base his armies on Dacinet, then thrust with all force across Skola against Trossonnet, and thereby neutralize Troyes' sea power, which was otherwise invulnerable. King Casimir made a fateful decision. He commanded 7 of his 12 armies to Bulmer scheme. Then, citing past sovereignty, present complaints, and his treaty with King Ivar Excelsis, he declared war upon King Granus of Trossonnet. King Ivar Excelsis had acted in a fit of fury and drunken bravado. When he became sober, he perceived the error of his strategy, which neglected an elemental fact. He was outmatched by the Troyes in every category: numbers, ships, military skills, and fighting spirit. He could take comfort only in his treaty with Lyonesse, and was correspondingly cheered by King Casimir's ready participation in the war. The marine transport of Lyonesse and Dacinet assembled at Bulmer Scheme, and there, at midnight, the armies of Lyonesse embarked and sailed for Dacinet. They discovered, first contrary winds, then, at dawn, a fleet of Troy's warships. In the space of 2 hours, half of the overloaded ships of Lyonesse and Dacinet were either sunk or broken on the rocks, with a loss of 2,000 men. The lucky half fled back downwind to Bulmer Scheme and grounded on the beach. Meanwhile, a miscellaneous flotilla of Troy's merchant ships, coastal cogs, and fishing vessels, loaded with Troy's troops, put into Archensio, where they were hailed as Lyonesse troops. By the time the mistake was discovered, the castle had been taken and King Ivar Excelsus captured. The war with Dacinet was over. Granus declared himself king of the Outer Islands, a realm still not so populous as either Lyonesse or Dehaut, but which held in total control the Lyre and the Cantabrian Gulf. The war between Trosinet and Lyonesse was now an embarrassment for King Casimir. He proposed a cessation of hostilities, and King Granus agreed, subject to certain terms. Lyonesse must cede the Duchy of Tremblance at the far west of Lyonesse, beyond the Troag, and undertake to build no warships by which it might again threaten Trosinet. King Casimir predictably rejected such harsh conditions, and warned of bitter consequences if King Granus persisted in his unreasonable hostility. King Granus responded, "Let it be remembered, I, Granus, instituted no war upon you. You, Casimir, made wanton war upon me. You were dealt a great and just defeat. Now you must suffer the consequences. You have heard my terms. Accept them, or continue a war which you cannot win, and which will cost you dearly in men, resources, and humiliation. My terms are realistic. I require the Duchy of Tremblance to protect my ships from the Scar. I can land a great force at Cape Farewell when so I choose. Be warned." King Casimir responded in tones of menace. "On the basis of a small and temporary success, you challenge the might of Lyonesse? You are as foolish as you are arrogant. Do you think that you can outmatch our great power? I now declare a proscription against you and all your lineage. You will be hunted as criminals and killed on sight. I have no more words for you." King Granus replied to the message with the force of his navy. He blockaded the coast of Lyonesse so that not so much as a fishing boat could safely navigate the Lyre. Lyonesse took its subsistence from the land, and the blockade meant only nuisance and a continuing affront, which King Casimir was powerless to rebuff. In his turn, King Granus could inflict no great damage upon Lyonesse. Harbors were few and well defended. Additionally, Casimir maintained a vigilant shore watch and employed spies in both Dacinet and Trosinet. Meanwhile, Casimir assembled a council of shipwrights and charged them to build swiftly and well a fleet of warships to defeat the Troyes. In the estuary of the river Syme, the best natural harbor of all Lyonesse, 12 keels went on the ways, and as many more at smaller yards on the shores of Balt Bay in the Duchy of Fetz. One moonless night along the Syme, when the ships were framed, planked, and ready for launching, 6 Troyes galleys stealthily entered the estuary and, despite fortifications, garrisons, and watches, burned the shipyards. Simultaneously, Troyes raiders landed in small boats along the shores of Balt Bay, burning shipyards, boats on the ways, and a great stock of timber planks. Casimir's plans for a quick armada went glimmering. In the green parlor at Hadion, King Casimir breakfasted alone on pickled eel, boiled eggs, and scones, then leaned back to ponder his many affairs. The defeat at Bulmer Scheme and its anguish had receded. He was able to assess the aftermath with at least a degree of dispassion. All in all, there seemed to be scope for cautious optimism. The blockade was a provocation and an insult which, for the nonce, in the interests of dignity, he must passively accept. In due course he would inflict harsh retribution, but for the present he must proceed with his grand design. In short, the defeat of King Audrey and restoration of the throne Evandig to Hadion. Dehat was most vulnerable to attack from the west, so to bypass the line of forts along the Pomperil border. The avenue of such an invasion led north from Knowlesby-Savin, past the castle Tinsinfirel, then north along that road known as the Trumpata into Dehout. The route was blocked by two staunch fortresses, Caul Bacach at the gates of Cerberus and Tinsinfirel itself. A South Ulfish garrison guarded Caul Bacach, but King Orianti of South Ulfland, in fear of Casimir's displeasure, had already granted Casimir and his armies freedom of passage. Tinsinfirel alone stood athwart Casimir's ambition. Tinsinfirel reared high above two gorges and controlled both the Trumpata and the way through Vale Evander into South Ulfland. Fode Carfilio, who ruled Vale Evander from his impregnable eyrie, in vanity and arrogance, recognized no master, least of all his nominal sovereign, King Orianti. An under-chamberlain entered the green parlor. He bowed before King Casimir. "Sir, a person waits upon your pleasure. He names himself Shimrod, and is here, so he declares, at your majesty's orders." Casimir straightened in his chair. "Bring him here." The under-chamberlain retired, to return with a tall young man of spare physique, wearing a smock and trousers of good cloth, low boots, and a dark green cap, which he doffed to reveal thick, dust-colored hair, cut at ear level after the fashion of the day. His features were regular, if somewhat gaunt, a thin nose, a bony jaw and chin, with a wide, crooked mouth and bright gray eyes, which gave him a look of drawl and easy self-possession, in which there was perhaps not quite enough reverence and abnegation to please King Casimir. "Sir," said Shimrod, "I am here in response to your urgent request." Casimir surveyed Shimrod with compressed mouth and head skeptically aslant. "For a fact, you are not as I expected you to be." Shimrod made a polite gesture, disclaiming responsibility for King Casimir's perplexity. King Casimir pointed to a chair. "Be seated, if you will." He himself rose and went to stand with his back to the fire. "I am told that you are trained in magic." Shimrod nodded. "Tongues will wag at every departure from the ordinary." Casimir smiled somewhat thinly. "Well then, are these reports accurate?" "Your Majesty, magic is a taxing discipline. Some persons have easy and natural abilities. I am not one of them. I am a careful student of the techniques, but that is not necessarily a measure of my competence." "What then is your competence?" "Compared to that of the adepts, the ratio is, let us say, 1 to 30. You are acquainted with Mergen? I know him well. And he has trained you? To a certain extent." King Casimir kept his impatience under control. Shimrod's airy mannerisms skirted safely around the far edge of insolence. Still, Casimir found them irritating, and his response to questions with precise but minimal information made conversation tiresome. Casimir spoke on in an even voice. "As you must know, our coast is blockaded by the Troyes. Can you suggest how I might break this blockade?" Shimrod reflected a moment. "Everything considered, the simplest way is to make peace." "No doubt." King Casimir pulled at his beard. Magicians were odd folk.
I prefer a method possibly more complicated, which will advance the interests of Lyonesse. You would have to counter the blockade with a superior force. Exactly so. That is the crux of my difficulty. I have thought to enlist the Ska as allies, and I wish you to foretell the consequences of such an act. Shimrod smilingly shook his head. Your Majesty, few magicians can read the future. I am not one of them. Speaking as a man of ordinary common sense, I would advise you against such an act. The Ska have known 10,000 years of travail. They are a harsh folk. Like you, they intend to dominate the Elder Isles. Invite them into the Lear, give them bases, and they will never depart. So much is obvious. King Casimir's gaze narrowed. He was seldom dealt with so briskly. Still, so he reasoned, Shimrod's manner might well be a measure of his candor. No one attempting to dissemble would use quite so easy a tone. He asked in a carefully neutral voice, What do you know of Tinsinfirel, the castle? This is a place I have never seen. It is said to be impregnable, as I am sure you already know. King Casimir gave a crisp nod. I have also heard that magic is part of its defense. As to that, I can't say. It was built by a lesser magician, Old Gaul, so that he might rule Vale Evander, secure from the syndics of Is. Then how did Carfilio gain the property? In this regard, I can only repeat rumor. King Casimir, with an impassive gesture, indicated that Shimrod was to proceed. Carfilio's own lineage is a matter of doubt, said Shimrod. It's quite possible that he was sired by the sorcerer Tamurello upon the witch Desmi. Still nothing is known, certainly, except that first Desmi disappeared, then Old Gaul, with all of his staff, as if devils had snatched them away, and the castle was empty, until Carfilio arrived with a troop of soldiers and took possession. It would seem that he also is a magician. I think not. A magician would conduct himself differently. Then you are acquainted with him? Not at all. I have never seen him. Still, you appear to be familiar with his background and personality. Magicians are as prone to gossip as anyone else, especially when the subject is as notorious as Carfilio. King Casimir pulled a bell cord. 2 footmen entered the parlor with wine, nuts, and sweetmeats, which they arranged upon the table. King Casimir seated himself across the table from Shimrod. He poured 2 goblets of wine, one of which he tendered to Shimrod. My best respects to your Majesty, said Shimrod. King Casimir sat looking into the fire. He spoke thoughtfully. Shimrod, my ambitions are perhaps no secret. A magician such as yourself could provide me invaluable aid. You would find my gratitude commensurate. Shimrod twirled the goblet of wine and watched the spin of the dark liquid. King Audrey of Dahout has made the same approach to Tamurello. King Ivar Excelsis sought the aid of Numik. All refused, by reason of Mergen's great edict, which applies no less to me. Pah! Snapped King Casimir. Does Mergen's authority transcend all other? In this regard, yes. King Casimir grunted. Still, you have spoken without any apparent restraint. I have only advised you as might any reasonable man. King Casimir rose abruptly to his feet. He tossed a purse upon the table. That will reimburse your service. Shimrod turned out the purse. 5 golden crowns rolled forth. They became 5 golden butterflies, which fluttered into the air and circled the parlor. The 5 became 10, 20, 50, 100. All at once they dropped to cluster upon the table, where they became 100 gold crowns.
Shimrod took 5 of the coins, returned them to the purse, which he placed in his pouch. "I thank your majesty." He bowed and departed the chamber. Odo, Duke of Folies, rode with a small company north through the Troag, a dreary land of crags and chasms, into South Ulfland, past Call Bocach, where opposing cliffs pressed so close together that 3 men could not ride abreast. A fan of small waterfalls fell into the defile to become the south fork of the Evander River. Road and river proceeded north side by side. Ahead rose a massive crag, the Tooth of Cronus, or the Tactor. Down through a gorge came the north fork of the Evander. The 2 forks joined and passed between the Tactor and the crag, which supported the castle Tinsinfiral. Duke Odo announced himself at a gate and was conducted up a zigzag road into the presence of Fode Carfilio. 2 days later he departed and returned the way he had come to Lyonesse town. He alighted in the armory yard, shook the dust from his cloak, and went directly to an audience with King Casimir. Hadion, at all times an echo chamber of rumor, immediately reverberated to the impending visit of an important grandee, the remarkable lord of 100 mysteries, Fode Carfilio of Tinsinfiral. Chapter 7. Suldrun sat in the orangery with her 2 favorite maids-in-waiting, Leah, daughter to Tondra, Duke of Sondbahar, and Tuiscene, daughter to the Earl of Merse. Leah already had heard much talk of Carfilio. "He is tall and strong, and is proud as a demigod. His gaze is said to fascinate all who look upon him." "He would seem an imposing man," said Tuiscene, and both girls looked sideways at Suldrun, who twitched her fingers. "Imposing men take themselves too seriously," said Suldrun. "Their talk is mostly orders and complaints." "There is much else," declared Leah. "It comes from my seamstress, who heard the conversation of Lady Padria. It seems that Fode Carfilio is the most romantic of men. Each evening he sits in a high tower watching the stars rise, pining." "Pining for what?" "For love. And who is the haughty maiden who causes him such pain?" "That is the curious part. She is imaginary. He worships this maiden of his dreams." "I find this hard to believe," said Tuiscene. "I suspect that he spends more time in bed with real maidens." "As to that I cannot say. After all, the reports may be exaggerated." "It will be interesting to discover the truth," said Tuiscene. "But here is your father, the king." Leah rose to her feet, as did Tuiscene, and more slowly Suldrun. All performed a formal curtsy. King Casimir sauntered forward. "Maidens, I wish to speak with the princess on a private affair. Please allow us a few moments alone." Leah and Tuiscene withdrew. King Casimir surveyed Suldrun a long moment. Suldrun turned half away, a chill of apprehension at the pit of her stomach. King Casimir gave a small, slow nod of the head, as if in corroboration of some private concept. He spoke in a portentous voice. "You must know that we are expecting the visit of an important person, Duke Carfilio of Vale Evander." "I have heard so much, yes." "You have come to marriageable age, and should Duke Carfilio find you pleasing, I would look favorably upon the match, and I shall impart so much to him." Suldrun raised her eyes to the golden-bearded face. "Father, I am not ready for such an event. I have not the slightest yearning to share a man's bed." King Casimir nodded. "That is sentiment properly to be expected in a maiden chaste and innocent. I am not displeased. Still, such qualms must bend before affairs of state. The friendship of Duke Carfilio is vital to our interests. You will quickly become accustomed to the idea. Now then,
Your conduct toward Duke Carfilio must be amiable and gracious, yet neither fulsome nor exaggerated. Do not press your company upon him. A man like Carfilio is stimulated by reserve and reluctance. Still, be neither coy nor cold." Suldrun cried in distress, "Father, I will not need to feign reluctance. I am not ready for marriage. Perhaps I never shall be." "Tush now!" King Casimir's voice sharpened. "Modesty is all very well in moderation, even appealing. Still, when exercised to excess, it becomes tiresome. Carfilio must not think you a prig. These are my wishes. Are they quite clear?" "Father, I understand your wishes very well."
"Good. Make certain that they influence your conduct."
A cavalcade of 20 knights and men-at-arms came down the spur arched and into Lyonesse town. At their head rode Duke Carfilio, erect and easy, a man with black curling hair cropped at his ears, a fair skin, features regular and fine, if somewhat austere, save for the mouth, which was that of a sentimental poet. In the armory yard the company halted. Carfilio dismounted, and his horse was led away by a pair of grooms in the lavender and green of Hadean. His retinue likewise dismounted and ranged themselves behind him. King Casimir descended from the upper terrace and crossed the yard. Duke Carfilio performed a bow of conventional courtesy, as did his company. "Welcome," spoke King Casimir. "Welcome to Hadean." "I am honored by your hospitality," Carfilio spoke in a voice firm, rich, and well-modulated, but lacking timbre. "I introduce you my seneschal, Sir Mungo. He will show you to your rooms. A collation is being laid, and when you are refreshed, we will take an informal repast on the terrace." An hour later, Carfilio stepped out on the terrace. He had changed to a robe of gray and black striped silk, with black trousers and black shoes, an unusual garment which enhanced his already dramatic presence. King Casimir awaited him by the balustrade. Carfilio approached and bowed. "King Casimir, already I am finding pleasure in my visit. The Palace Hadean is the most splendid of the Elder Isles. Its prospect over city and sea is without parallel." King Casimir spoke with stately affability. "I hope that your visit will often be repeated. We are, after all, the closest of neighbors." "Precisely so," said Carfilio. "Unluckily, I am vexed with problems which keep me preoccupied at home, problems happily unknown to Lyonesse." King Casimir raised his eyebrows. "Problems? We are by no means immune. I count as many problems as there are choice in Trossinet." Carfilio laughed politely. "In due course we must exchange commiserations." "I would as lief exchange problems. My robbers, footpads, and renegade barons for your blockade of warships, it would seem a bad bargain for both of us. As an inducement, you might wish to include 1,000 of your scaw." "Gladly, were they my scaw. For some odd reason they avoid South Ulfland, though they rampage across the north blithely enough." A pair of heralds blew a shrill, sweet fanfare to signal the appearance of Queen Solace and a train of her ladies. King Casimir and Carfilio turned to meet her. King Casimir presented his guest. Queen Solace acknowledged Carfilio's compliments with a bland stare, which Carfilio graciously ignored. Time passed. King Casimir became restive. He glanced over his shoulder toward the palace ever more frequently. Finally, he muttered a few words to a footman, and another 5 minutes passed. The heralds raised their clarions and blew another fanfare. Out upon the terrace came Suldrun at a lurching run, as if she had been pushed. In the shadows behind her the contorted face of Lady Desdea showed for an instant. With a grave face, Suldrun approached the table. Her gown, of a soft pink stuff,
clung close to her figure. From beneath a round white cap, soft golden curls hung to her shoulders. Slowly Suldrun came forward, followed by Leah and Tuisany. She paused, looked across the terrace, brushing Carfelio with her gaze. A steward approached with a tray. Suldrun and her maids took goblets of wine, then went modestly apart, where they stood murmuring together. King Casimir watched under lowering brows, and at last turned to Sir Mungo, his seneschal. "Inform the princess that we wait upon her attendants." Sir Mungo delivered the message. Suldrun listened with a drooping mouth. She seemed to sigh, then crossed the terrace, halted in front of her father, and performed a somber curtsy. In his richest tones, Sir Mungo declared, "Princess Suldrun, I am honored to introduce to you Duke Fode Carfelio of Vale Evander." Suldrun inclined her head. Carfelio smilingly bowed and kissed her hand. Then, raising his head and looking into her face, he said, "Rumors of Princess Suldrun's grace and beauty have crossed the mountains to Tinsinfirel. I see that they were not exaggerated." Suldrun responded in a colorless voice, "I hope you have not heeded these rumors. I'm sure they would give me no pleasure if I heard them." King Casimir leaned quickly forward with lowering brows, but Carfelio spoke first. "Indeed? How so?" Suldrun refused to look toward her father. "I am made out to be something I do not choose to be." "You do not enjoy the admiration of men?" "I have done nothing admirable. Nor has a rose, nor a sapphire of many facets. They are ornaments. They have no life of their own." "Beauty is not ignoble," said King Casimir heavily. "It is a gift bestowed to only a few. Would anyone, even the Princess Suldrun, prefer to be ugly?" Suldrun opened her mouth to say, "I would prefer, first of all, to be somewhere other than here." She thought better of the remark and closed her mouth. "Beauty is a most peculiar attribute," Carfelio declared. "Who was the first poet? It was he who invented the concept of beauty." King Casimir gave an indifferent shrug and drank from his purple glass goblet. Carfelio continued, his voice easy and musical. "Our world is a place terrible and wonderful, where the passionate poet who yearns to realize the ideal of beauty is almost always frustrated." Suldrun, her hands clasped together, studied her fingertips. Carfelio said, "It would seem that you have reservations? Your passionate poet might well be a very tiresome companion." Carfelio clapped his hand to his forehead in mock outrage. "You are as heartless as Diana herself. Have you no sympathy for our passionate poet, this poor moon-struck adventurer?" "Probably not. He seems over-emotional and self-centered at the very least. The Emperor Nero of Rome, who danced to the flames of his burning city, was perhaps such a passionate poet." King Casimir made a restive movement. This sort of conversation seemed a pointless frivolity. Still, Carfelio appeared to be enjoying himself. Was it possible that timid, reclusive Suldrun was cleverer than he had supposed? Carfelio addressed himself to Suldrun. "I find this conversation most interesting. I hope that we can continue it another time." Suldrun replied in her most formal voice, "Truly, Duke Carfelio, my ideas are not at all profound. I would be embarrassed to discuss them with a person of your experience." "It shall be as you wish," said Carfelio. "Still, please allow me the simple pleasure of your company." King Casimir hastened to intervene before Suldrun's unpredictable tongue gave offense. "Duke Carfelio, I notice certain grandees of the realm who wait to be introduced." Later, King Casimir took Suldrun aside. "I am surprised by your conduct in regard to Duke Carfelio. You do more harm than you know.
His goodwill is indispensable to our plans."
Standing before the majestic bulk of her father, Suldrun felt limp and helpless. She cried out in a plaintive, soft voice,
"Father, please do not force me upon Duke Carfilio. I am frightened by his company."
King Casimir had prepared himself against piteous appeals. His response was inexorable. "Bah! You are silly and unreasonable. There are far worse matches than Duke Carfilio, I assure you. It shall be as I decide." Suldrun stood with down-turned face. She apparently had no more to say. King Casimir swung away, marched off down the long gallery and up the stairs to his chambers. Suldrun stood looking after him, hands clenched and pressed to her sides. She turned and ran down the gallery, out into the fading light of afternoon, up the arcade, through the old gate and down into the garden. The sun, hanging low in the sky, sent a somber light under a tall bank of clouds. The garden seemed cool and remote. Suldrun wandered down the path, past the ruins, and settled herself under the old lime tree, arms clasped around her knees, and considered the fate which seemed to be advancing upon her. Beyond doubt, or so it seemed to her, Carfilio would choose to wed her, take her away to Tinsinfiral, there at his own good time to explore the secrets of her body and her mind. The sun sank into clouds, the wind blew cold. Suldrun shivered. Rising, she returned the way she had come, slowly, with eyes downcast. She climbed to her chambers, where Lady Desdia gave her a fretful scolding.
"Where have you been? By the Queen's command, I must array you in fine garments. There is to be a banquet and dancing. Your bath is ready."
Suldrun passively stepped out of her clothes and into a wide marble basin, brimming with warm water. Her maids rubbed her with soap of olive oil and ash of aloe, then rinsed her in water scented with lemon verbena, and dried her with soft cotton towels. Her hair was brushed till it shone. She was dressed in a dark blue gown, and a fillet of silver, set with tablets of lapis lazuli, was placed on her head. Lady Desdia drew back.
"That's the best I can do with you. No doubt but what you are well favored. Still, something is lacking. You must use a bit of flirtation. Not to excess, mind you. Let him know that you understand what he has in mind. Mischief in a girl is like salt on meat. Now, tincture of foxglove to sparkle your eyes." Suldrun jerked back. "I want none of it." Lady Desdia had learned the futility of argument with Suldrun. "You are the most obstinate creature alive. As usual, you shall do as you please." Suldrun laughed bitterly. "If I did as I please, I would not be going to the ball." "La then, you saucy minx." Lady Desdia kissed Suldrun on the forehead. "I hope that life will dance to your tune. Come now to the banquet. I pray you be civil to Duke Carfilio, since your father hopes for a betrothal." At the banquet, King Casimir and Queen Solace sat at the head of the great table, with Suldrun at her father's right and Carfilio to the left of Queen Solace. Covertly, Suldrun studied Carfilio. What with his clear skin, thick black hair, and lustrous eyes, he was undeniably handsome, almost to an excess. He ate and drank gracefully. His conversation was courteous. Perhaps his only affectation was modesty. He spoke little of himself. Yet Suldrun found herself unable to meet his gaze, and when she spoke to him, as occasion compelled, words came with difficulty. Carfilio sensed her aversion, so she divined, and it only seemed to stimulate his interest. He became ever more fulsome, as if he sought to overcome her antipathy by sheer perfection of gallantry. All the while, like a chill on the air, Suldrun felt the careful attention of her father, to such an extent that she began to lose her composure. She bent her head over her plate, but found herself unable to eat. She reached for her goblet and chanced to meet Carfilio's eyes. For a moment she stared transfixed. "He knows what I think," went her thoughts. "He knows. and now he smiles as if already he owned me. Suldrun wrenched her gaze down to her plate. Still smiling, Carfelio turned to listen to the remarks of Queen Solace. At the ball, Suldrun thought to evade notice by mingling with her maids-in-waiting, but to no effect. Sir Escher, the under-seneschal, came to seek her out and took her into the presence of King Casimir, Queen Solace, and Duke Carfelio, and other high dignitaries. When the music started, she was convenient to the arm of Duke Carfelio and dared not refuse. In silence they stepped the measures back and forth, bowing, turning with graceful gesture among colored silks and sighing satins. 1,000 candles in 6 massive candelabra suffused the chamber with mellow light. When the music stopped, Carfelio led Suldrun to the side of the room and somewhat apart. "I hardly know what to say to you," Carfelio remarked. "Your manner is so glacial as to seem menacing." Suldrun replied in her most formal voice, "Sir, I am unaccustomed to grand affairs, and in all truth, they do not amuse me." "So that you would prefer to be elsewhere?" Suldrun looked across the chamber to where Casimir stood among the grandees of his court. "My preferences, whatever they may be, seem to be of consequence only to myself. So I have been given to understand." "Surely you are mistaken. I, for one, am interested in your preferences. In fact, I find you most unusual." Suldrun's only response was an indifferent shrug, and Carfelio's airy whimsicality for a brief moment became strained, even a trifle sharp. "Meanwhile, your opinion of me is a person ordinary, drab, and perhaps something of a bore?" So much said in the hope of exciting a tumble of embarrassed disclaimers. Suldrun, looking off across the room, responded in an absent-minded voice, "Sir, you are my father's guest. I would not presume to form such an opinion, or any opinion whatever." Carfelio uttered a soft, strange laugh, so that Suldrun turned in startled puzzlement to look as through a rift into Carfelio's soul, which quickly made itself whole. Once more debonair, Carfelio held out his hands to express polite and humorous frustration. "Must you be so aloof? Am I truly deplorable?" Suldrun once more used cool formality. "Sir, certainly you have given me no reason to form such judgments." "But is that not an artificial pose? You must know that you are admired. I, for one, am anxious to gain your favorable opinion." "Sir, my father wants to marry me away. That is well known. He pushes me faster than I want to go. I know nothing of love or loving." Carfelio took both of her hands and compelled her to face him. "I will reveal some arcane facts. Princesses seldom marry their lovers. As for loving, I would willingly teach a pupil so innocent and so beautiful. You would learn overnight, so to speak." Suldrun pulled her hands away. "Let us rejoin the others." Carfelio escorted Suldrun to her place. A few minutes later she informed Queen Solace that she felt unwell and slipped quietly from the chamber. King Casimir, elevated by drink, failed to notice. On Durfey Meadow, 2 miles south of Lyonesse town, King Casimir ordained a pageant and pleasure fair to celebrate the presence of his honored guest, Fode Carfelio, Duke of Vale Evander and Lord of Tinsinfiral. Preparations were elaborate and bountiful. Bullocks had been turning over coals since the preceding day, with good bastings of oil, onion juice, garlic, and syrup of tamarind. Now they were done to a turn and exuded a tantalizing waft across all the meadow. Trays nearby were heaped high with loaves of white bread, and to the side 6 tons of wine awaited only a starting of the bungs. Villages of the neighborhood had sent young men and women in festival costumes. To the music of drums and pipes, they danced jigs and kicksteps until sweat beaded their foreheads.
At noon, clowns fought with bladders and wooden swords, and somewhat later, knights of the royal court jousted with lances tipped with leather pillows. The tournament in which armored knights jousted with lances or fought mock battles had not yet evolved. Contests of this time and place were relatively mild events, competitions at wrestling, horse racing, vaulting, events in which the aristocracy seldom, if ever, competed. Meanwhile, the roast meat had been lifted to the carving table, cut into slices and chunks, and taken away on half-loaves of bread by all who chose to partake of the king's bounty, while wine bubbled happily through the spigots. King Casimir and Carfilio watched the jousting from a raised platform, in company with Queen Solace, Princess Suldrun, Prince Cassander, and a dozen others of rank. King Casimir and Carfilio then strolled across the meadow to watch an archery contest, and conversed to the hiss and chunk of arrow striking into butt. 2 from Carfilio's retinue had entered the contest and were shooting with such proficiency that King Casimir was moved to comment. Carfilio responded, "I command a relatively small force, and all must excel with their weapons. I reckon each soldier the equal of 10 ordinaries. He lives and dies by steel. Nonetheless, I envy you your 12 great armies." King Casimir gave a dour grunt. 12 armies are a fine thing to command, and King Audrey sleeps poorly on their account. Still, 12 armies are useless against the Troyes. They sail back and forth against my shores, they laugh and joke, they pull up beside my harbor and show me their naked backsides. Well beyond bowshot, no doubt? 50 yards beyond bowshot. Most vexing. King Casimir spoke weightily. My ambitions are no secret. I must reduce Dehout, subdue the Scar, and defeat the Troyes. I will bring the throne Evandig and the table Cairbre on Maiden to their rightful places, and once more the Elder Isles will be ruled by a single king. That is a noble ambition, said Carfilio graciously. Were I king of Lyonesse, I would strive no differently. The strategies are not easy. I can work south against the Troyes, with the Scar as allies, or into the Ulflands, presupposing that the Duke of Vale Evander allows me thoroughfare past Tinson-Firel. Then my armies drive the Scar from the foreshore, overawe the Godelians, and turn eastward into Dehout for the climactic campaign. With a flotilla of 1,000 ships, I overwhelm Trosinet, and the Elder Isles are once more a single kingdom, with the Duke of Vale Evander, now Duke of South Ulfland. It is a pretty concept, and, I would think, feasible. My own ambitions are not affected. Indeed, I am content with Vale Evander. I have yearnings of quite a different sort. In all candor, I have become enamored of the Princess Suldrun. I find her the most beautiful of living creatures. Would you consider me presumptuous if I asked her hand in marriage? I would consider it a most suitable and auspicious match. I am happy to hear your approval. What of Princess Suldrun? She has allowed me no conspicuous favor. She is somewhat fanciful. I will have a word with her. Tomorrow you and she shall take your betrothal vows in a ceremonial rite, and nuptials will follow in due course. This is a joyful prospect for myself and, so I hope, the Princess Suldrun as well. Late in the afternoon, the royal carriage returned to Haedion, with King Casimir, Queen Solace, and Princess Suldrun. Riding on horseback beside were Carfilio and young Prince Cassander. King Casimir spoke to Suldrun in a ponderous voice. Today I have conferred with Duke Carfilio, and he declares himself enamored of you. The match is advantageous, and I agreed to your betrothal. Suldrun stared aghast. Her worst apprehensions realized. Finally she found her tongue. Sir, can you not believe me? I want no marriage now, least of all to Carfilio. He does not suit me at all. King Casimir brought the full impact of his round-eye blue gaze to bear on Suldrun. "This is niminy-piminy petulance. I will hear none of it. Carfelio is a noble and a handsome man. Your qualms are over-nice. Tomorrow at noon you will pledge troth to Carfelio. In 3 months you shall marry. There is no more to be said." Suldrun subsided into the cushions. The carriage rumbled along the road, swaying on springs of layered hornbeam. Poplars beside the road passed in front of the sun. Through tears, Suldrun watched lights and shadows playing across her father's face. In a soft, broken voice, she essayed a final plea. "Father, do not force this marriage on me." King Casimir listened stolidly, and turning his face away, made no reply. In anguish, Suldrun looked to her mother for support, but saw only waxen dislike. Queen Solace said tartly, "You are marriageable, as anyone with eyes can see. It is time you were away from Hadeon. With your vapors and vagaries, you have brought us no joy." King Casimir spoke. "As a princess of Lyonesse, you know neither toil nor care. You dress in soft silk and enjoy luxuries beyond the hopes of ordinary women. As a princess of Lyonesse, you also must bend to the dictates of policy, even as I. The marriage will proceed. Have done with this petty diffidence, and approach Duke Carfelio with amiability. I will hear no more on the subject." Upon arrival at Hadeon, Suldrun went directly to her chambers. An hour later, Lady Desdia found her staring into the fire. "Come now," said Lady Desdia. "Moping causes the flesh to sag and yellows the skin. Be of good cheer, then. The king desires your presence at the evening meal in an hour's time." "I prefer not to go." "Still, you must. The king has given his order. So hey nonny no, to supper we shall go. You shall wear the dark green velvet which becomes you, so that every other woman looks a dead fish. Were I younger, I would gnash my teeth for jealousy. I cannot understand why you sulk." "I have no taste for Duke Carfelio." "Tush! In marriage all things alter. You may come to dote on him. Then you will laugh to think of your foolish whims. Now then, off with your clothes. Hey-ho! Think how it will be when Duke Carfelio gives the command. Sosha! Where is that flippet of a maid? Sosha! Brush the princess's hair, 100 strokes to either side. Tonight it must glisten like a river of gold." At the supper, Suldrun tried to achieve an impersonal manner. She tasted a morsel of stewed pigeon. She drank half a glass of pale wine. When remarks were addressed to her, she responded politely, but clearly her thoughts were elsewhere. Once, looking up, she met Carfelio's gaze, and for a moment stared into his lambent eyes, like a fascinated bird. She shifted her gaze and broodingly studied her plate. Carfelio was undeniably gallant, brave, and handsome. Why then her antipathy? She knew her instincts to be accurate. Carfelio was involuted. His mind teemed with strange rancors and peculiar inclinations. Words entered her mind as if from another source. For Carfelio, beauty was not to be cherished and loved, but something to be plundered and hurt. The ladies left for the queen's drawing room. Suldrun quickly ran off to her own chambers. Early in the morning, a brief rain swept in from the sea to wash the greenery and settle the dust. By mid-morning, the sun shone through broken clouds and sent hurrying shadows across the city. Lady Desdia arrayed Suldrun in a white gown with a white surcoat, embroidered in pink, yellow, and green, and a small white cap inside a golden diadem studded with garnets. On the terrace, 4 precious rugs had been laid end to end, from Hadeon's ponderous main entrance to a table draped with heavy white linen. Antique silver vases, 4 feet tall, overflowed with white roses. The table supported the sacred chalice of the Lyonesse kings. A silver vessel, a foot tall, carved with characters no longer intelligible to Lyonesse savants. As the sun rose toward noon, dignitaries began to appear, wearing ceremonial robes and ancient emblems. At noon, Queen Solace arrived. She was escorted by King Casimir to her throne. Behind came Duke Carfilio, escorted by Duke Tandra of Sondbahar. A moment passed. King Casimir looked toward the door, where the Princess Suldrun should now be appearing. On the arm of her aunt, the Lady Desdia. Instead, he glimpsed only a flutter of agitated motion. Presently, he noted the beckoning arm of Lady Desdia. King Casimir rose from the throne and strode back to the palace where Lady Desdia stood gesturing in confusion and bewilderment. King Casimir looked around the foyer, then turned back to Lady Desdia. "Where is Princess Suldrun? Why do you cause this undignified delay?" Lady Desdia blurted an explanation. "She was ready. She stood there beautiful as an angel. I led the way downstairs. She followed. I went along the gallery, and I had a strange feeling. I stopped and turned to look, and she stood there pale as a lily. She called out something, but I could not quite hear. I think she said, 'I cannot. No, I cannot.' And then she was gone, out the side door and away up under the arcade. I called after her to no avail. She would not look back." King Casimir turned and walked out on the terrace. He halted, looked around the half-circle of questioning faces. He spoke in a harsh monotone. "I beg the indulgence of those now assembled. The Princess Suldrun has suffered indisposition. The ceremony will not proceed. A collation has been laid out. Please partake as you wish." King Casimir turned and re-entered the palace. Lady Desdia stood to the side, hair in disorder, arms hanging like ropes. King Casimir inspected her for 5 seconds, then stalked from the palace. Up the arcade, under Zoltra Brightstar's wall, through the timber gate, and down into the old garden he strode. Here Suldrun sat, on a fallen column, elbows on knees and chin in her hands. King Casimir halted 20 feet behind her. Slowly, Suldrun looked around, eyes wide, mouth drooping. King Casimir said, "You have come to this place in defiance of my command." Suldrun nodded. "I did so, yes." "You have marred the dignity of Duke Carfilio in a manner which can know no mitigation." Suldrun's mouth moved, but no words came. King Casimir spoke on. "For frivolous whim you have come here rather than in dutiful obedience to the place required by my command. Therefore, remain in this place, both night and day, until the great hurt you have done me is assuaged, or until you are dead. If you depart either boldly or by stealth, you shall be slave to whomever first lays claim to you, be he knight or peasant, loon or vagabond, no matter. You shall be his thing." King Casimir turned, climbed the path, passed through the gate which closed hard behind him. Suldrun turned slowly, face blank and almost serene. She looked out to sea, where rays of sunlight shot through gaps in the clouds and down at the water. King Casimir found a silent group awaiting him on the terrace. He looked this way and that. "Where is Duke Carfilio?" Duke Tandra of Sondbahar came forward. "Sire, upon your departure he waited 1 minute. Then he called for his horse, and with his company he rode from Hadion." "What said he?" cried King Casimir. "Gave he no notice of any kind?" Duke Tandra responded, "Sire, he spoke no word." King Casimir cast one terrible glance around the terrace, then turned and walked on long strides back into the palace Hadion. King Casimir brooded for a week, then uttered an angry expletive and set himself to the composition of a letter. The final version read, "For the notice of the noble Duke Fode Carfilio at Tinsinfiral his castle. Noble Sir, with difficulty I write these words. in reference to an incident which has given me great embarrassment. I cannot properly apologize, since I am as much victim of the circumstances as yourself, perhaps even more. You suffered an affront, which understandably caused you exasperation. Still, there is no doubt but what a dignity such as yours is proof against the vapors of a captious and silly maiden. On the other hand, I have lost the privilege of uniting our houses through a marital link. Despite all, I can convey my sorrow that this event occurred at Hadean, and so, in this measure, marred my hospitality. I trust that in the generous breadth of your tolerance, you will continue to look upon me as your friend and ally in mutual endeavors of the future. With my best regards, I am Casimir, Lyonesse, the king. An envoy carried the letter to Tinsinfiral. In due course, he returned with a response. For the attention of His August Majesty, Casimir of Lyonesse, the king. Revered Sir, be assured that the emotions I derived from the incident to which you refer, while they arose within me, understandably, I hope, like a storm, subsided almost as quickly, and left me embarrassed for the narrow verges of my forbearance. I agree that our personal association should in no way be compromised by the unpredictabilities of a young maiden's fancy. As always, you may rely upon my sincere respect and my great hope that your proper and legitimate ambitions may be realized. Whenever the wish comes upon you to see something of Vale Evander, be assured that I shall welcome the opportunity to extend to you the hospitality of Tinsinfiral. I remain in all amiability, your friend, Carfilio. King Casimir studied the letter with care. Carfilio apparently cherished no pangs of resentment. Still, his declarations of goodwill, while hearty, might have gone somewhat farther and been more specific.
Thank you for listening to our audiobooks. We do our best to regularly upload quality books with clear narrations. Please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell icon so we can bring you more great books. Thank you very much, and we hope you enjoyed listening to your audiobook.